Darkness in Tudor England was not a gentle dimming of the world. It was an event, a daily catastrophe, a cosmic door slam. One moment you were finishing your chores and the world looked perfectly normal. The next, the sun dipped behind the horizon like it was running late for its own execution. And suddenly every single thing around you disappeared. Not became hard to see, not got a bit moody. No, it vanished. The Tudor night wasn't dark, it was a physical substance thick enough to trip over. Before we step into the dark, torchlit nights of Tudor England, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and whether it's day or deep into the dark where you are. Now let's begin. Today's world has spoiled us with streetlights, screen glow, neon signs, refrigerators with personality disorders that light up when you walk past them. But a Tudor evening had none of that. When the sun was gone, the only illumination you had came from fire, a candle, a lantern, or a hearth. And even those small luxuries weren't exactly generous with their glow. A single candle didn't light a room. It simply made one corner of it slightly less terrifying. It was less a tool for visibility, and more a polite suggestion that maybe the void around you contained fewer nightmares than it felt like. But that tiny flame came at a cost. Candles weren't cheap, especially the clean-burning ones made from beeswax, reserved for the wealthy and God. Everyone else used tallow candles, animal fat moulded into light, which sputtered, smoked, smelled a bit like regret and burned down far too fast. You didn't casually light a candle to set the mood. You lit one because you needed to perform essential tasks like praying, mending clothes, or locating the floor. If you let it burn too long, congratulations, you just spent tomorrow's breakfast. And so most Tudor households practiced the ancient revered art of going to bed embarrassingly early. Not because they were well-rested people, but because staying awake required illumination, and illumination cost money. Early bedtime wasn't a lifestyle, it was an economic strategy. Outside, darkness was even worse. Step beyond your doorway, and the world turned into an uncharted abyss. Rural life meant long stretches of fields, hedgerows and forests, none of which bothered to emit a convenient glow. Urban life wasn't much better. Tudor towns had narrow lanes, overhanging buildings, crooked alleys, and absolutely zero lamps, unless the moon was feeling charitable. Walking at night wasn't simply difficult. It was a form of voluntary suspension of common sense. You could fall into a ditch, wander into a river, collide with a horse, or discover the unique sensation of walking directly into a stranger who was equally terrified and equally blind. Two panicked Tudors meeting in the dark must have been history's quietest jump scares. Inside the home, darkness still managed to complicate everything. Houses were small, beams were low, and furniture did not move out of your way no matter how many times you kicked it. You memorized the layout of your living space not because you were emotionally attached to it, but because navigating it after sunset was like trying to escape a maze where the walls were sharp and your toes were fragile. Even lying down was a hazard. Lying down too fast meant blowing out the candle accidentally, and then you had to choose between relighting it, expensive, or accepting that you would now fall asleep with no knowledge of what was sharing the room with you. Emotionally expensive. Speaking of which, Tudor houses made noises. Wood creaked, wind moaned, animals scurried. And every single sound, without exception, felt like a personal threat. Darkness amplified everything, your own heartbeat, rustling straw in the mattress, the house settling, the wind scraping against the shutters. Modern people pay for sound machines that play relaxing forest ambience. Tudors lived with actual forests and did not relax. Yet for all its inconvenience and terror, Tudor darkness structured life. It dictated work hours, determined safety, shaped religious habits, and even dictated social behaviour. People rose with the sun not because they were motivated, but because the alternative was stumbling around in a void. Night was the divider between one day's survival and the next. And survival, simple as it sounds, was always the point. The fascinating thing is that Tudor people weren't necessarily afraid of the dark because it was dark. They were afraid because anything could be in it. Darkness wasn't passive, it was a busy, invisible marketplace of possibilities, none of them good. You couldn't see danger approaching, but danger could certainly see you, or so it felt. Shadows weren't shadows, they were hiding places. Silence wasn't peaceful, it was suspicious. Even familiarity changed. A table you'd passed 10,000 times in daylight looked like an executioner's silhouette after sunset. Darkness didn't just obscure the world, it invited imagination to misbehave. People filled the invisibility with ghosts, spirits, thieves, demons, and more mundane terrors like tripping over the family pig. Night was a collaborator with fear, a stage for insecurity, and a daily reminder that Tudor life was built on managing risk, not eliminating it. And the truth is, Tudor people weren't wrong to be cautious. Their environment, limited technology, and lack of lighting made night genuinely hazardous. They learned to respect the dark because the dark in turn respected no one. But for all its menace, Tudor darkness did serve one comforting purpose. It ended the day. It forced you to stop working, to gather with family, to pray, to rest, and to accept that for now, the world would simply have to wait. The good news? You survived the Tudor night. The bad news? You survived it mostly by going to bed at 6 p.m. to avoid lighting another candle. Fire in Tudor England was not just a household tool, it was a temperamental roommate with a talent for causing drama at the worst possible moment. A Tudor home relied on fire for everything: warmth, cooking, light, safety, and basic survival. But fire also had a deeply unhelpful habit of devouring the entire building the moment you looked away. If darkness in the previous part was a lurking threat, fire was the bold, energetic one that announced, "I'm here," and then occasionally took your life savings. Every Tudor dwelling, whether a wealthy merchant's townhouse, a farmer's timber-framed cottage, or a cramped urban tenement, contained 3 essential ingredients for disaster: wood, thatch, and open flame. Think of it as living inside a giant, flammable birthday cake, except the flames weren't celebratory and the candles were rude enough to fall over without warning. The hearth was the centre of the home, the beloved heart of family life. It cooked every meal, warmed frostbitten hands, and filled the house with smoke that doubled as mosquito repellent. But Tudor parents didn't tuck their children in by saying, "Good night, sleep tight." They more likely whispered, "If a stray ember leaps out while we're asleep, well, good luck to us all." The hearth didn't simply glow, it plotted. Add to this the fact that chimneys were sometimes optional, poorly built, or clogged with centuries of soot, turning homes into delightful fire funnels. And even when chimneys worked properly, sparks had a habit of wandering out like drunk party guests looking for trouble. A single ember landing on a straw mattress, wooden floorboard, or thatched roof could transform an entire street into a public bonfire. Fire didn't need much. It was an overachiever that way. Candles were no better. Their flame was small, yes, but not modest. Tallow candles dripped, sputtered, and occasionally threw sparks with the enthusiasm of a toddler discovering gravity. They fell over. They burned unevenly, they got knocked onto tablecloths, onto clothing, onto beds stuffed with straw and feathers, all of which responded to flame with an impressive level of enthusiasm. And since candles were expensive, people stretched their use far past the point of safety, letting them burn dangerously low until the flame licked the edge of the holder, like it was considering something stupid. Night was the worst time for fires because Tudor families were asleep, exhausted from a day of labour that modern humans would classify as several punishments in a trench. Before bed, the hearth should have been responsibly raked down. A comforting phrase meaning, "I hope you buried those glowing embers well enough that they won't crawl out and kill us in our sleep." But even careful families couldn't eliminate the threat. Wood settles, sparks travel. A strong draught from a poorly shuttered window could toss embers across the room like nature was trying its hand at archery. Urban areas faced even greater danger. Houses were packed closely together, leaning into the street like gossips sharing secrets. One rooftop fire could leap to another, and then another, creating a catastrophic chain reaction. Tudor cities saw entire blocks consumed in a single night, leaving behind nothing but ash and a long list of neighbours who all claimed they smelled smoke but thought someone else would deal with it. Fire wasn't just a domestic problem, it was a neighbourhood hobby. Towns created regulations to minimise risk, but Tudor enforcement ranged from lenient to the law exists, but you'd better enforce it yourself. Wealthier homes sometimes employed a night watch boy, whose job was essentially to wander around the house after bedtime, making sure everything remained upright, unlit and unexploded. This was a responsible idea, except the watch boy was often 10 years old and prone to falling asleep on duty, sometimes directly beside the hearth he was supposed to watch. Fire prevention strategies did not always demonstrate sophistication, and yet fire was impossible to avoid. Even the safest household needed flames for cooking, heating water, and staying alive through winter. The only alternative was freezing, starving, or sitting in total darkness praying that warmth would magically appear. Fire was as essential as it was dangerous, an unpredictable companion you relied on despite knowing it might betray you dramatically. Nighttime fires struck with terrifying speed. One moment the family was asleep, the next they woke coughing, choking on smoke that filled the room like a living thing. There were no smoke alarms, no fire blankets, no emergency exits. Windows were small, beds were tucked into corners, staircases were narrow, and doors sometimes swelled in the damp night air, refusing to open exactly when you most needed them to act professional. Responses were frantic. Buckets flew, neighbours shouted, people ran outside in their nightshirts, looking less like fire survivors and more like confused birds. Community fire brigades didn't exist. Instead, you had neighbours desperately trying to form a bucket chain while simultaneously rescuing their own belongings. And in the cruelest twist of all, the river needed to supply water for the bucket chain was often a long, inconvenient distance from the house, making fire response less heroic sprint and more slow, wet despair. The terrifying truth was that a Tudor family could lose everything, home, goods, savings, tools, heirlooms, in a single night. Fire didn't discriminate, it didn't negotiate. It didn't care that you still had rent due, or that you'd spent 3 months saving for a new pewter dish. Once fire decided your home was optional, the only thing left to do was run. And so every night before sleep, Tudor people performed a ritual as old as the hearth itself. Check the sparks, bank the coals, extinguish the candles, pray you wake up to the same number of walls you fell asleep with. Fire kept you warm, until it didn't. Night in Tudor England did more than chance the world. It loosened its morals. The same pitch-black curtain that hid families inside their timber homes also hid the people creeping toward those doors with intentions that were, at best, entrepreneurial and at worst, aggressively redistributive. Because while honest Tudor folk went to bed early to save candle money, thieves preferred a different schedule, one that began precisely when decent people blew out the lights. Let's start with the most basic truth. Tudor locks were not good. These weren't iron masterpieces of security engineering. They were simple wooden latches, metal hooks, crude bolts, and occasionally a lock that could be opened with a stick, a wiggle, or a gentle argument. Calling them security devices was generous. They were decorative confidence boosters. When a Tudor householder slid that wooden bar across the door, they weren't preventing a break-in. They were expressing hope. The average Tudor home was built for ventilation, not defence. Walls were thin, window shutters were often held closed with a latch so unimpressive it might as well have been a suggestion. Gaps existed everywhere, between planks, under eaves, around doors, large enough for light, sound, insects, stray cats, and, unfortunately, hands. A determined burglar didn't always need to break in. Sometimes the door simply allowed entry out of sheer politeness. Night thieves came in several varieties, none of them reassuring. There were opportunistic prowlers who walked the streets listening for households that had gone to bed early, checking doors the way modern people check vending machines, just in case something good drops out. Then there were skilled burglars, the ones who brought their own tools, small knives to lift bar latches, hooks to snag valuables left near windows, and, most dangerously, actual knowledge of how homes were constructed. If you knew which wall panel was loose or which stable door had a gap, You could steal a family's winter food stores without ever stepping inside. Night crime thrived because Tudor towns were designed for secrecy, whether they meant to be or not. Streets were narrow and winding, alleys turned abruptly into dead ends, houses leaned toward each other like gossiping acquaintances sharing shadows. In this environment, once the sun went down, visibility dropped to feels like blindness. A thief could disappear simply by stepping slightly left. Patrols existed, but their coverage was uneven. Parishes hired watchmen more out of tradition than competence, and while some took the role seriously, others took it as an opportunity to nap standing up. Their lanterns cast a small halo of light, but only enough to reveal their own existence. If a thief stayed 5 steps back in the shadows, he might as well have been in another dimension. The quiet of night made crime even easier. Without carriages, industry, or nightlife, the world settled into a hush that meant every sound mattered. And yet many night crimes were shockingly silent. A skilled burglar knew how to lift a latch without a click, climb window frames without creaking, and move across floors with the delicacy of a guilty cat. The victims, meanwhile, slept on straw mattresses that squeaked loudly if they moved too fast, meaning the thief sometimes had better stealth acoustics than the homeowner. What did thieves steal? Everything. The modern idea of valuables locked away in a safe did not exist. Possessions were few, precious, and often stored in plain sight. Clothing, tools, shoes, dishes, blankets, salted meat, candles, coins, ale jugs, even the family's supply of firewood. Anything that required effort to acquire was fair game. A thief didn't need to be ambitious. Stealing a single woolen cloak could keep him warm for a year, or buy him enough ale to forget the moral implications of his career. Animals were a favourite target too. Sheep, goats, chickens. If it could walk away quietly, someone would encourage it to do so. Nighttime livestock theft was so common that families often slept within arm's reach of their animals, not out of affection, but because replacing them required money most people didn't have. But the most unsettling thefts weren't the big ones. They were the ones that proved the thief had been inches away from the sleeping family. Imagine waking up to find your best pot missing from the table beside your bed, or discovering footprints near the window where your child slept. Tudor crime didn't just take belongings, it took peace of mind. This dread was magnified by the simple truth that justice was unreliable. Thieves were rarely caught unless someone recognized them, confessed, or had the misfortune of being the only person in town with shoes that matched the footprints. Fingerprints, forensic evidence, and CCTV were obviously non-existent. And even if you caught a thief, hauling him to court required time, money, and the kind of energy a starving farmer rarely had. So Tudor families relied on prevention, if one could call it that. They placed heavy objects in front of doors. They hung noisy items, bells, pots, chains, where a thief might trip them. They moved valuables farther from windows. They trained dogs to bark at anything, which dogs were only too happy to do. But even these measures weren't foolproof. A determined thief considered these obstacles mild inconveniences. Like a pop quiz he hadn't studied for but still intended to pass. And so bedtime came with the same quiet, universal prayer. Please let everything still be here in the morning. Fire threatened your home with destruction, but thieves threatened it with subtraction. One could reduce your family to ashes, the other could reduce it to poverty. And the worst part, you never knew who was out there in the dark, moving silently, guided by familiarity with shadows, and the confidence that your lock, such as it was, existed mostly for decoration. Night belonged to thieves because they understood something Tudor people knew but tried not to think about. In the darkness, everyone is equally blind, but not everyone is equally honest. Being outside at night in Tudor England wasn't just risky, it was suspicious. The darkness didn't merely hide danger, it created legal consequences. If daylight was the realm of honest business, respectable conversation, and trying not to annoy your neighbours, then nighttime was, according to Tudor authorities, the realm of absolutely everything they didn't want happening. Curfew laws were widespread, though their specifics varied across towns and parishes. Some places insisted that citizens extinguish their lights by a certain hour. Others demanded that people simply stop wandering around after sunset. But the core idea was the same everywhere. After dark, the world belonged to watchmen, patrolling clergy, and anybody who considered snoring a nightly civic contribution. If you were outdoors past curfew, the authorities didn't ask why, they asked what you were plotting. Curfew wasn't just tradition. It was preventative policing centuries before anyone invented the phrase. Nighttime was the moment when crime, sin, immorality, gossip, drunkenness, and general chaos felt boldest. The logic was simple. If no one respectable was supposed to be outside, then anyone found outside was, by definition, not respectable. A tidy little circle of legal reasoning that solved the government's problems and created new ones for everyone else. Picture this. You step out of your home after dusk, perhaps because your cow has broken loose, or because your neighbour's chicken is screaming, or because you swear you heard something rustling in the grain store. Perfectly legitimate reasons, completely innocent. Within minutes, a watchman blocks your path, lantern in hand, wearing an expression that can best be described as, "I don't know what you did, but you definitely did it." "What's your business?" he asks, and suddenly it hits you. Explaining the truth sounds exactly like lying. "My cow ran away" is a valid explanation at 2 p.m. At midnight, it sounds like code for treason. The penalties for being out after curfew weren't always severe, but they were humiliating enough to discourage the habit. You could be detained, questioned, fined, or forced to stand before local officials and explain, in painful detail, which part of your evening went so horribly wrong that you found yourself outdoors like a wandering tragedy. Some towns even kept public records of nighttime arrests, ensuring that everyone knew you'd committed the heinous crime of being outside while other people were responsibly asleep. Gossip travelled faster than the law, and soon half the parish believed you were involved in smuggling, witchcraft, seduction, political conspiracy, or, worst of all, unlicensed merriment. Watchmen, meanwhile, had the uniquely Tudor job description of enforcing order with minimal equipment, maximum self-confidence, and a professional belief that after sunset, every human being was up to no good. They patrolled streets with lanterns, halberds, staves, and a heroic sense of purpose, even if some of them were too old, too drunk, or too underpaid for the role. When a watchman stopped you, he was not only the law, he was the face of the community's opinion of your life choices, and watchmen loved questions. So many questions. Why are you out? Who sent you? Where are you going? What's in your hand? What do you mean? You don't know what noise you heard? Are you aware of the hour? Do you consider yourself a responsible adult? Being outside after curfew turned ordinary people into terrified philosophers, stammering explanations that sounded increasingly implausible the longer they spoke. Curfew also shaped the rhythm of everyday life. Taverns closed earlier than you might expect, not because patrons had lost enthusiasm for ale, they never did, but because staying late made the trip home a legal obstacle course. If you stumbled through the streets at midnight smelling like beer and regret, a watchman didn't assume you were heading home. He assumed you were heading toward crime, sin, or, given your gait, earthquake-like instability. Even legitimate nighttime professions face scrutiny. Midwives summoned to births, bakers beginning their long pre-dawn shifts, and messengers carrying urgent notes all needed to justify their movement through the streets. A midwife could save 2 lives in the same night and still get interrogated on her way home. A baker carrying flour might be asked whether it was actually suspicious powder of some sort. A messenger running at full speed was indistinguishable from someone running away from a crime until proven otherwise, which was not ideal for productivity. And then there was the social shame. A nighttime arrest didn't automatically result in punishment, but it absolutely resulted in conversation. Your neighbours would quietly nod at you the next morning, giving you the sort of smile people reserve for scandalous rumours they can't legally say out loud. They didn't need to know what you were doing. You were outside after curfew, that was story enough. But beneath the embarrassment and inconvenience lay a darker truth. Curfew laws existed because the Tudor state genuinely feared the night. Darkness was an ally to rebellion, gatherings, smuggling, secret meetings, and every behaviour the authorities could not easily observe. Maintaining order meant controlling not just people but time itself. So when the bell rang announcing curfew, you didn't argue, you didn't negotiate, you didn't say, "But I just need to finish one thing." You went inside, shut the door, and hoped it stayed quiet until morning. Surviving the night was one thing. Explaining to the watch why you were awake during it was often far more dangerous. If the Tudor night was a swirling stew of shadows, creaking timbers, suspicious footsteps, and questionable noises, then the only thing standing between you and the full buffet of nocturnal disaster was the night watchman, a figure who embodied equal parts courage, community service, and mild confusion. He was the guardian of the sleeping town, the defender of peace, and the person you sincerely hoped was awake when you weren't. The Night Watch wasn't a single title, but a duty performed across towns and parishes in varying degrees of enthusiasm and competence. It existed long before professional policing. The Tudor world had no detectives, no constables on horseback, no organised patrol units. What it had was a man with a lantern, a wooden staff, a bell, and the stubborn conviction that discussing the hour out loud would frighten criminals into submission. "2 of the clock and all's well," he would shout, sometimes to reassure the public, sometimes to reassure himself. Let's begin with the most important truth. Being a night watchman was not glamorous. The job required staying awake for hours in the cold, damp, and darkness, while listening for suspicious noises and hoping they were not, in fact, suspicious. You walked through empty streets filled with shadows, avoiding animals, drunkards, puddles that smelled like sin, and any door that looked like it might fling open and reveal something you were underpaid to deal with. Watchmen were equipped with a lantern, dim, flickering, and mostly decorative, and a staff which was less a weapon and more a walking stick that offered moral support. Their bell, however, was crucial. It allowed them to announce their presence, raise alarms, and let potential thieves know exactly where the watchman was at all times, which was perhaps not the most strategic choice, but certainly a loud one. The recruitment process for this role was loose. Some towns hired older men who could no longer perform heavy labour, but still possessed enough energy to pace slowly and glare at the dark. Others rotated the responsibility among male householders as a civic duty, creating a system where your butcher, your neighbour, or the man who sold questionable turnips in the market might spend the night defending the entire parish. Expertise was optional. Availability was the real qualification. This meant the night watch varied wildly in quality. You might have an experienced man who took pride in his vigilance, marching determinedly through the lanes with the confidence of someone who had seen actual danger and survived it. Or you might have a watchman who treated the shift as an opportunity for quiet reflection, leaning against a wall and contemplating life until dawn startled him awake. Flexible alertness, as we politely call it, was common, and yet despite their inconsistencies, watchmen served a vital purpose. They were visible. Their presence alone discouraged many crimes. A would-be thief hearing the night watchman announce, 3 of the clock and all's well, might reconsider his evening plans. Even the lantern, weak but symbolic, sent a message. Someone was awake, someone was watching, and someone was capable of shouting loud enough to wake the entire parish. But the watchmen did more than patrol. They responded to alarms, when dogs barked, when windows rattled, when a terrified family screamed that they heard footsteps in the yard. They intervened in tavern brawls that spilled into the street, herded drunkards back to safety, and stopped quarrels from escalating into something more medieval. They kept an eye out for fires, sniffing the air for smoke like anxious bloodhounds with a profound fear of everything flammable. They knocked on doors to alert residents when danger loomed, often becoming the unwelcome midnight visitor every Tudor dreaded but absolutely needed. They also played a crucial role in enforcing curfew. Anyone found wandering after dark without a clear purpose faced interrogation, or what the watchman considered interrogation, which ranged from stern questioning to mildly accusatory shrugging. "Your presence is noted," a watchman might declare, which sounded official even if he had no idea what it meant. If you were suspicious enough, you might be escorted home, fined, or detained until morning. There was also a ceremonial element to the job. Announcing the hour wasn't just a tradition, it was part reassurance, part surveillance. People depended on it. A shout in the distance meant the watch was awake, on duty, and possibly even sober. It reminded sleepers that someone was out there walking cold streets so they didn't have to. And if the shout didn't come, well, that was far more terrifying. Despite their noble intentions, night watchmen had natural enemies. Darkness, fog, and weather. Rain turned streets into slippery hazards. Fog swallowed lantern light whole. Winter froze fingers and toes until even gripping the staff became a negotiation. And above all, the human body did not want to remain awake through long, monotonous hours. Many watchmen solved this by patrolling with another man, hoping conversation would keep them alert. Others solved it by accidentally falling asleep on someone's porch, which technically still counted as guarding it. Of course, public sentiment toward the watch varied. Some people viewed them as essential protectors. Others saw them as a mildly irritating soundtrack to their sleep, shouting announcements, clanging bells, and occasionally knocking on the wrong door. And some found them theatrical, lurching through foggy streets like background characters in a supernatural morality play. Yet for all the jokes and complaints, one fact remained. Without the watch, the night belonged entirely to uncertainty. Their lanterns provided the only predictable glow in a world of unpredictable darkness. Their voices were the only reminders that civilization had not fully retreated when the sun disappeared. Your safety may have depended on a man with a bell, a stick, and questionable alertness, but in Tudor England, that was still better than depending on silence. For a Tudor person, nighttime wasn't just dark, it was occupied. The living shared the evening hours with a population that technically should have stayed in their graves but rarely respected property lines. Spirits, ghosts, wandering souls, unfinished business, whatever you called them, the Tudor world believed the dead had a deeply problematic habit of stretching their legs after sundown. This wasn't an age of comforting ghost stories told around a campfire. No, Tudor England's supernatural life wasn't entertainment. It was nightly risk assessment. You didn't ask whether ghosts existed. You asked where they were, what mood they were in, and whether they might mistake your house for a convenient haunting venue. The belief was rooted in religion, folklore, and centuries of whispered warnings passed down through households like heirlooms nobody wanted but everyone kept. Tudor Christians accepted the idea that the afterlife had strict categories, heaven, hell, purgatory, but the boundaries were not as secure as one might hope. Souls could wander for a number of reasons: unfinished sins, unresolved promises, improper burials, sudden deaths, or simply because eternity was boring and nighttime offered better lighting conditions for appearing dramatic. Cemeteries, of course, were the most active spiritual districts. Tudor burial grounds were often located right beside parish churches, meaning you could walk home after evening prayer while passing dozens of potential night shift workers. Tombstones weren't decorative, they were warnings. People believed souls might rise, drift, or glide across the churchyard, especially on certain nights of the year, when the veil between worlds was said to thin, like a curtain with moth holes. But ghosts weren't polite enough to stay near their assigned resting places. They wandered into homes, across fields, along roadsides, or even into inns where travellers already had enough to worry about without spectral roommates. It wasn't just the dramatic, sheet-wearing apparitions of later ghost lore. Tudor ghosts might knock, whisper, rattle objects, tap on windows, or manifest as fleeting shapes that made your blood pressure skyrocket and your candle flame flicker in disapproval. One of the most unsettling Tudor beliefs involved restless spirits returning to correct the living. Break a promise to a dead relative, expect a midnight visit, hide money from your family before dying. Your ghost might reappear to loudly complain, fail to repay a debt. The afterlife offered no protection from accountability. Your spectral form might show up to demand repayment with more persistence than you managed while alive. People also feared spirits announcing death. A knocking on the door with no visible knocker could be a dead family member delivering bad news. A shadow passing across the room could be an omen. A sudden coldness wasn't just poor insulation. It was your late Aunt Mildred dropping by with an unsolicited update on your fate. The Tudor mind didn't view ghosts as abstract metaphors. They were active participants in the community, albeit deeply inconvenienced by their lack of physical form. Entire households had rituals to protect against nightly spiritual traffic. Some left a candle burning in a window as a kind of supernatural keep walking, nothing to see here. Others placed protective herbs near beds, or recited prayers before sleep specifically addressing any dead relatives who might be feeling restless or petty. Nighttime noises carried spiritual weight. A creak wasn't just wood settling, it might be a ghost deciding whether to make itself visible. A sudden whisper of wind could be a soul passing by. And if your dog started growling at an empty corner, you didn't chalk it up to canine imagination. You assumed your dog was seeing something you absolutely did not want to see. Ghost stories were often tied to morality. A person who died violently, unjustly, or treacherously might become an especially active ghost. Murder victims weren't believed to rest easily, and neither were wrongdoers who escaped earthly punishment. The message to the living was clear. Behave yourself, or your afterlife might involve a very long commute. Night travel became even riskier because of this belief. Roads were lonely, forests dense, and crossroads, those symbolically loaded intersections of fate, were practically spiritual roundabouts where any wandering soul might decide to linger. People avoided them after dark unless absolutely necessary, and even then they walked fast, muttering prayers as though reciting them at a high speed might create a protective shield. Inns had their own reputation for hauntings. Travellers frequently reported noises in empty rooms, footsteps in halls, or mysterious figures at the foot of the bed. Considering the structural integrity of some Tudor inns, those footsteps might have simply been other travellers, rats, or the sound of roof beams preparing to collapse. But the Tudors preferred supernatural explanations. They weren't wrong, just generous with possibilities. One of the most widespread beliefs involved the walking dead who returned home because of unfinished business. Some were benign, souls asking for prayers to hasten their exit from purgatory. Others were vengeful, targeting enemies, unfaithful spouses, or anyone who had inconvenienced them. If a ghost showed up at your window at night, it wasn't because it missed you. It needed something, and refusing was not recommended. And so Tudor people approached sleep with an interesting mix of fear and resignation. Yes, there might be a ghost drifting through your hallway. Yes, that whisper could be supernatural communication. Yes, that cold spot might be a wandering ancestor passing through the room to check whether you finally repented for that mild sin you committed 8 years ago. But what could you do? You had no electric lights to chase away shadows, no comforting science to explain odd phenomena, and no reliable way to ignore a knock that wasn't a knock. The dead didn't rest peacefully in Tudor imagination. They paced. For the Tudor imagination, nighttime didn't simply cloak the world in darkness. It activated it. The daytime belonged to labourers, merchants, clergy, and the official business of village life. But the night belonged to witches, whose alleged powers were believed to stretch, sharpen, and strengthen once the sun disappeared. If spirits paced, witches worked, and no Tudor wanted to become their midnight project. Witchcraft, in the Tudor understanding, wasn't a vague atmospheric threat. It was a set of very specific dangers performed by very specific people, usually women living at the edges of society, both literally and socially. A widow who knew too much about herbs? Suspicious. A midwife whose patient didn't survive childbirth? Dangerous. A neighbour you'd quarrelled with who then glared at you? Potentially lethal. Witchcraft accusations often grew out of ordinary tensions. Cows that produced no milk, butter that refused to churn, children who fell sick. But the timing was crucial. If misfortune struck after dark, the explanation sharpened into certainty, and night was when witches were believed to leave their homes, sometimes physically, sometimes in spirit, to perform acts that Tudor people found both terrifying and impressively creative. They were said to ride on broomsticks, animals, or even transformed household objects. They travelled to secret gatherings where they pledged loyalty to dark forces, received magical instructions, or swap tips on ruining society one curse at a time. The Tudors imagined witches as the ultimate nocturnal task force, a group of highly motivated individuals with aggressive night shifts. The most feared witchcraft activities involved maleficium, direct harm done to others through supernatural means, and the Tudor night was full of malefic possibilities. A witch might slip through the shadows to mutter a curse outside your window. She might gather ingredients from graveyards, crossroads, or riverbanks, locations that for some reason always had the worst branding. She might craft a poppet, a primitive doll stuffed with hair or nail clippings taken from a victim, and if you were her target, she didn't need to be near you to cause damage. She only needed the night, which obliged her like a loyal assistant. Even livestock suffered from the witch-related paranoia. A cow that stopped giving milk, a hen that laid no eggs, a horse that stumbled, these were not simple misfortunes. To the Tudor mind, these were signs of a witch's nocturnal handiwork. Animals were particularly vulnerable at night, their nighttime behaviour interpreted as spectral correspondence. A restless horse wasn't reacting to cold or discomfort, it was detecting a witch. A startled dog wasn't barking at nothing, it was sounding a supernatural alarm their owners wished they could ignore. One of the most anxiety-inducing beliefs involved night flying. Tudor people genuinely worried that witches left their bodies and flew through the air, sometimes in animal form, sometimes in spirit form, sometimes on broomsticks powered by ointments with ingredients far too unsettling for comfort. The idea that someone could leave their home undetected, glide invisibly across the night sky, and drop curses like medieval airstrikes kept many a villager awake far later than their candle budget allowed. Witches were also thought to gather at specific night hours for rituals, often midnight, a time believed to lie between one day and the next, a seem-in reality where the rules loosened. These gatherings, known later as sabbats, were imagined as wild, chaotic, and deeply sacrilegious. Singing, dancing, and feasting with supernatural entities were all staples of Tudor witch lore. Whether these details came from doctrine, rumour, or the creative imagination of terrified villagers is debatable, but they shaped the common fear. If you heard strange noises at night, something unholy might be clocking in for work. Illnesses and personal misfortunes were often blamed on witches as well. A sudden fever that struck at midnight wasn't just a fever, it was an attack. A baby crying at odd hours could be interpreted as a sign that a witch had tried, and possibly succeeded, in stealing its vitality. The night made ordinary ailments look supernatural, because the dark was not just a backdrop in Tudor life, it was a co-conspirator. And so, the Tudor household armed itself with spiritual defences. Prayers, charms, herbs, and protective symbols were placed near beds, windows and doors. Rowan branches, iron objects, and blessed candles lit far more cautiously than ordinary ones were believed to repel witchcraft. Families whispered preventative verses before sleep, hoping their words would erect invisible walls witches could not breach. Whether these measures were effective or just psychological support didn't matter. Night needed defending, and the Tudors didn't take chances. Accusations of witchcraft often began with nighttime observation. If a neighbour was seen wandering outside after dark, perhaps for an innocent reason like checking on livestock, it automatically raised suspicion. If she carried a lantern, she was concealing something. If she carried nothing, she was looking for something. Any nighttime activity that didn't involve sleeping was a cause for alarm. To villagers who feared witches, nothing was more suspicious than a woman who preferred the night for errands. The fear was so powerful that courts took nighttime testimony seriously. Witnesses claimed they saw witches outside homes whispering curses, flying above roofs, or meeting with dark spirits under the moon. Even dreams counted as evidence. If someone dreamed of a neighbour harming them, that dream could indicate real supernatural danger. Night had a way of turning imagination into memory, and memory into accusation. For Tudor people, the night wasn't silent. It was scheming. The darkness offered witches everything they needed: secrecy, symbolism, and a natural cloak for misfortune. And so every Tudor evening ended the same way, with a whispered hope that your name wouldn't make it onto some witch's to-do list. Because if the night was quiet, it wasn't peaceful. It was plotting. For a Tudor Christian, the night was not merely a physical danger or a playground for witches. It was a battlefield of the soul. If spirits wandered and witches plotted, demons were the ones believed to do the heavy lifting. Darkness wasn't simply the absence of light. It was the presence of everything the church warned you about on Sundays. And nothing made a Tudor's skin crawl like the idea that when the lights went out, the devil clocked in. Religion shaped how Tudors interpreted the night. The church taught that the world was full of invisible forces fighting for human souls, and the night was when those forces had the home field advantage. During the day, people worked under the gaze of neighbours, clergy and sunlight, which conveniently illuminated sin before it had the chance to settle. But night offered privacy, and in Tudor theology, privacy offered temptation. If daylight encouraged virtue, darkness invited negotiations. The devil, in the Tudor worldview, was not a distant philosophical concept. He was a literal being actively invested in the downfall of humanity and deeply committed to customer outreach. Preachers described him with the enthusiasm of men who believed every household was one wrong choice away from a moral catastrophe. He whispered doubts, planted sinful thoughts, and waited for moments of weakness. And nothing weakened a Tudor faster than the silence and stillness of nighttime. One widespread belief was that demons roamed most freely after sunset, seeking lonely, tired, or worried individuals to influence. The night stripped away distractions, leaving people alone with their fears, doubts, and memories of mildly questionable decisions made that day. A guilty conscience became fertile ground for spiritual intrusion. A jealous thought, a moment of anger, a whispered complaint, all were seen as cracks in the soul's armour through which darker forces could slip. Sleep itself was regarded with suspicion. When the body rested, the soul became vulnerable. Dreams, especially vivid or troubling ones, were interpreted as possible communications, messages from God, attacks from demons, or temptations crafted to lure you off the righteous path. A pleasant dream could be a trap. A frightening dream could be a warning. And a dream involving your neighbour's attractive spouse? A demonic ambush disguised as nighttime entertainment. People prayed intensely before bed, not only to thank God for surviving the day, but to ask protection from what might visit during the coming hours of defenceless slumber. Children were taught to repeat specific prayers that functioned like spiritual alarm systems. Adults clutched rosaries, placed crosses near their beds, or traced protective symbols on the wooden frames. Many believed demons could sit on a sleeper's chest, whisper in their ear, or manipulate dreams to encourage sinful thoughts, acts of nighttime psychological warfare centuries before the invention of the term. Nighttime temptation wasn't limited to dreams, either. The devil was believed to exploit loneliness, grief, and fatigue. A man who had lost a child might feel the devil urging him toward despair. A woman struggling with hunger might be tempted to steal food, justifying it to herself while the devilish voice whispered affirmations. Even small frustrations could open the door. Anger over a neighbour's success, envy of someone's wealth, resentment toward a spouse. At night, in the quiet, these emotions grew louder, and the Tudors feared that demons amplified them with professional-level enthusiasm. Demons were also blamed for specifically nocturnal mischief, objects falling without explanation, sudden noises, or the eerie sense of being watched. If a candle blew out unexpectedly, a demon was testing household faith. If a door creaked open, the devil was reminding you he had access to hinges. Even bodily sensations took on spiritual significance. A sudden chill could indicate a demonic presence. A heavy feeling in the room meant something unholy had arrived uninvited. And if a shadow moved without explanation, congratulations. You'd just received a nighttime visitation from a being whose job description included haunt, tempt, ruin. Religious leaders fueled these anxieties with sermons that left parishioners both morally fortified and absolutely terrified to walk home after dusk. The message was clear. Virtue was a daytime responsibility, but nighttime was the devil's jurisdiction. Many Tudor homilies emphasized the importance of resisting temptation in the dark, warning that moral failures committed at night carried heavier spiritual consequences since they were committed when one should have been asleep. Some families took extreme measures to protect their homes. Holy water sprinkled around the bed, scriptures hung above doorways, charms carved with biblical verses. The placement of religious imagery was strategic, anything that created a spiritual no trespassing sign for demons. People believed walls could not keep out what walked on spiritual feet, but symbols could at least make them hesitate. Fasting, confession, and repentance were also tools against nighttime influence. A soul kept clean was harder for demons to manipulate. A guilty soul, however, was as attractive to demonic attention as a freshly baked pie was to a hungry villager. The Tudors feared their own moral vulnerabilities, because to them, the devil didn't just tempt the wicked, he recruited the careless. But the deepest anxiety was not that demons wandered outside, it was that demons paid attention. They observed. They listened. They waited for moments when a person was too tired, too sad, or too frustrated to resist. In a world already filled with physical hardship, the notion that your worst internal struggles were also spiritual battles made every night feel like a test. You might fail simply by having a very human thought. Darkness wasn't empty to the Tudor mind. It was crowded, with enemies you couldn't see but absolutely believed were there. If daytime was when God observed your behaviour, nighttime was when he commented on it. For the Tudors, sleep was not a private escape from the world, but a spiritual inbox. And nightmares were the kind of messages you couldn't delete. They believed dreams carried meaning, instruction, and sometimes divine correction. A nightmare wasn't just a nightmare. It was a telegram from heaven, a celestial performance review, or an early warning alert that something in your life or your soul needed urgent attention. Tudor society lived under a worldview in which God communicated through signs, omens, and natural events. So why wouldn't he also use the one time of day when people were actually quiet enough to listen? Dreams were considered the perfect medium, intimate, undeniable, and delivered directly to your mind with no chance of being intercepted by nosy neighbours. The Tudors understood sleep not as biological maintenance but as a nightly theological appointment. Nightmares were especially charged with meaning. Pleasant dreams could be dismissed as wishful thinking or digestion gone rogue, but nightmares, they had weight. A frightening dream could indicate that God was warning you of approaching danger, signalling disapproval of your actions, revealing hidden sins, or gently, and sometimes not so gently, suggesting that you reconsider your life choices before something unpleasant happened. Waking up drenched in sweat meant you didn't just sleep badly, you'd been visited. The church reinforced this interpretation with gusto. Preachers quoted biblical examples, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel deciphering nightmares in Babylon, and other scriptural moments where God delivered messages via the dream world. If God spoke through nightmares in the Bible, he could certainly do it in Dorset. Clergymen urged their congregations to reflect on dreams carefully, even anxiously. A nightmare could be a divine prompt to repent, reconcile with an enemy, change one's behaviour, or prepare for misfortune, and people took these messages seriously. If a Tudor dreamed of falling, burning, drowning, or being chased, they didn't say, stress. They said, Lord, what are you trying to tell me? Even symbolic dreams, famines, storms, crumbling houses, were seen as metaphors for spiritual decay or looming trouble. If you dreamed of a neighbour being struck down, that neighbour might receive a polite, concerned morning visit that began with, I saw something unsettling about your future, and I think we should pray. Dreams involving family members were especially fraught. If a child appeared sick or distressed in a nightmare, parents interpreted it as divine concern and watched the child with hawk-like intensity the next day. If a deceased relative appeared, their presence was taken as a message from God through someone who already had access to heavenly insight. A dead parent arriving in a dream could be comforting, but it could also be alarming, especially if they looked stern. A spectral scolding was not the kind of afterlife correspondence anyone wanted. Nightmares sometimes even shaped life and death decisions. A troubling dream before a long journey could convince someone to postpone travel entirely. Likewise, a nightmare about a marriage could delay, or in some cases end, an engagement. If a Tudor farmer dreamed of wolves, he might keep the herd indoors for extra days. If he dreamed of a poor harvest, he might ration early. Dreams weren't treated as hints, they were treated as instructions. Interpreting them, however, was a delicate art. The Tudors had no shortage of opinions about what symbols meant, and households collected dream lore the way others collected recipes. Biblical references, medieval treatises, folk superstition, and family traditions all merged into a surprisingly complex system. Fire in a dream might mean wrath, sin, or looming conflict. Falling could signal a loss of mortal footing. Storms might represent God's displeasure, or actual weather headed your way. Animals symbolized temptations, dangers, or warnings depending on whether the animal seemed too friendly. Dark figures could represent adversaries, devils, or fears you hadn't confessed yet. And if you dreamed of losing teeth, that was practically a divine broadcast predicting the death of someone close, which meant Tudor mornings occasionally began with a household inventory of who was still alive. Some nightmares felt so significant that people consulted clergy for interpretation. Priests, already burdened with resolving neighbourly feuds and reminding parishioners to stop arguing during services, suddenly became dream analysts. They listened patiently or dramatically to recountings of bizarre nighttime terrors involving plays, serpents, collapsing barns, or emotionally confused sheep. And because Tudors saw meaning everywhere, priests rarely said, "That was just a nightmare." They said, "Let's discuss what God may be showing you." Of course, not all nightmares were messages from above. Some were believed to be tests, divine barometers of your resistance to sin. If you dreamed of forbidden pleasures, you were encouraged to confess the next day, apologizing even if the sin occurred only in dream form. After all, a dream was not simply an accident of the subconscious, it was a revelation of your inner spiritual state, whether you wanted it revealed or not. But the most unsettling nightmares of all were those that seemed prophetic. Stories circulated of people dreaming of shipwrecks, fires, or deaths that later happened exactly as seen. Whether these tales were exaggerated, misremembered, or simply fueled by the human desire for patterns, they reinforced the belief that sleep could hold glimpses of tomorrow. A nightmare wasn't just divine mail, it could be a divine schedule preview. And all of this meant one thing: sleep was not restful. Tudors lay down each night aware that God, angels, saints, or supernatural messengers might contact them at any moment with a dream that could shake their confidence, alter their plans, or expose their conscience. Morning wasn't simply a matter of stretching and yawning, it was a moment of reflection. What did I dream, and what does it demand of me? You didn't have a bad dream. You received mail, and ignoring it felt spiritually expensive. In Tudor England, going to sleep healthy was no guarantee you'd wake up the same way, or at all. The night had a reputation for turning mild discomfort into biblical catastrophes. A cough could become a crisis, a headache could evolve into a fever, a stomach pain could prompt the family to begin mentally dividing your belongings before breakfast. If daytime was when disease revealed itself, nighttime was when it made decisions. The simple truth was that Tudor bodies lived in a constant tug-of-war with their environment. Poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, questionable diets, close living quarters, and immune systems trained mostly by exposure to every germ that had ever walked the earth. People expected illness the way modern people expect bills, regular, inconvenient, and often arriving earlier than hoped. But nothing frightened them like sickness that arrived while they were unconscious, quietly transforming a normal night's rest into a medical ambush. Part of the fear stemmed from how quickly Tudor diseases progressed. Infections that today would be treated with antibiotics instead brewed unchecked, sometimes shifting from mild to deadly in a matter of hours. Fevers spiked rapidly, pustules formed overnight, Swellings appeared like surprise decorations, and symptoms escalated faster than anyone could respond. You didn't call a doctor in the morning, you prayed you survived long enough to send someone to get one. Nighttime was when these medical dramas unfolded. While Tudor people slept on straw mattresses teeming with microscopic roommates, their bodies fought battles they couldn't witness. A scratch from a farm tool, a bite from an insect, a chill caught fetching water. Any tiny incident could erupt into a dangerous infection in the dark. And since Tudor medical understanding was a lively blend of observation, superstition, and confident guesswork, families often woke to find a loved one in distress with no idea what caused it. Illness also hid well in the dark. Without artificial lighting, families couldn't easily examine a patient until sunrise. Symptoms like discoloration, rashes, or swelling were details you discovered in daylight, often accompanied by someone whispering, "Oh dear, that wasn't there yesterday." By then, the illness might already be galloping toward tragedy. The phrase "it came on suddenly" appeared in countless Tudor accounts, but suddenly often meant during the night when we couldn't see anything. Some diseases were especially feared for their nighttime speed. The sweating sickness, a Tudor-era terror, could strike after a day of perfect health and kill within hours. Go to bed warm, wake up drenched, delirious, or not at all. Plague symptoms too could manifest overnight, swelling under the arms or groin, violent chills, and dark blotches appearing like ink stains from a vengeful pen. Even common fevers could surge while a patient slept, leading to dangerous dehydration, hallucinations, or organ failure before morning's first candle flickered. The psychological impact was enormous. Every Tudor sleep came with the unspoken awareness that tomorrow might bring a new diagnosis, one delivered not by a physician, but by your own terrified relatives leaning over you at dawn. Being found ill in the morning became a grimly common phrase, signalling a chain of events no family wanted to start, sending for help, preparing remedies, alerting neighbours, summoning clergy, or, if things looked especially dire, beginning spiritual preparations for a farewell. Households developed habits to ease the anxiety. Parents checked on children multiple times during the night, listening for unusual breathing or the ominous rattle of fevered coughing. Spouses listened to each other's sleep not romantically, but medically, monitoring for sudden illness or frightening restlessness. Families often slept close together not only for warmth but to monitor health. If someone groaned, muttered, or tossed violently, others woke immediately, ready to interpret the sound as either a mild discomfort or a dire omen. The remedies available did not inspire confidence. Tudor treatments included herbal brews, poultices, bleeding, purging, sweating, charms, and prayers, a healthcare strategy based on the philosophy of throw everything at the illness and hope one thing sticks. When sickness struck overnight, families scrambled to boil water, fetch herbs, awaken the neighbour who claimed to know cures, the success rate of these cures being, politely speaking, mixed, or send a child sprinting for the nearest doctor who might arrive hours later with a hopeful look and a very small toolkit. And then there was the social fallout. An overnight sickness didn't just trouble the patient, it threatened the whole community. Illness meant potential contagion, and Tudor villagers responded quickly. If someone woke with symptoms resembling plague, the household could be quarantined, doors marked, and neighbours instructed to pretend the family no longer existed. Fear made people pragmatic. You might receive a sympathetic sigh through the wall, but no one risked entering your house unless the situation threatened their conscience or their inheritance. Worse still, sudden sickness carried a moral dimension. Some believed overnight illness reflected divine displeasure, making families fear not just for the body but for the soul. Had the patient sinned? Had the family neglected spiritual duties? Was this punishment or warning? Illness wasn't merely medical, it was theological. And the night was when God often chose to deliver his sternest notes. The emotional weight of it all meant Tudors went to sleep each night with a mix of exhaustion and apprehension. A peaceful night didn't guarantee a peaceful morning. Tudor people learned to greet each dawn with cautious optimism, Stretch, breathe, check your temperature, wiggle your fingers, and look around to confirm you still existed. Because in this world, you didn't simply wake up tired. You woke up, and sometimes that was the greatest achievement of all. You went to bed healthy. You woke up historically unavailable. For Tudor parents, nighttime was not a peaceful retreat from the day's labour. It was a vigil. Infants and young children lived in such fragile balance that any hour of darkness could tip it. If the day brought exhaustion, the night brought dread, because the one sound that terrified Tudor parents most was silence. A quiet nursery was not an accomplishment. It was a warning. Infant mortality was a constant shadow over family life. Disease, malnutrition, poor sanitation, dangerous birthing conditions, and simple vulnerability made the first years of life perilous. But while children could fall ill at any time, many deaths occurred or were discovered during the night. The darkness concealed symptoms, hid changes, and muffled the subtle signals of distress parents desperately needed to hear. In a world without lamps bright enough to illuminate a room, darkness didn't just obscure danger, it allowed it to proceed undetected. Tudor infants typically slept in cradles beside their parents' bed, or wrapped tightly and swaddling near their mothers, but even proximity offered no guarantees. Mothers often drifted in and out of sleep, trained by experience to react to the smallest whimper. They listened for breathing, for stirring, for fussing, anything that meant the child was still alive. A suddenly quiet baby, especially one who'd been restless earlier, could send a jolt through a parent's chest faster than any nighttime noise ever could. This fear was more than emotional intuition. It was grounded in brutal experience. Sudden infant death could result from countless causes: suffocation from heavy bedding, infection that worsened while parents slept, respiratory problems, or the mysterious nighttime collapses that modern science still struggles to fully explain. A baby who went to sleep with only mild symptoms might worsen drastically within hours. By morning, the child's body could be cold, stiff, or unresponsive, leaving parents to grapple with the horrifying realization that life had slipped away in silence, shielded by the darkness they despised. The lack of medical understanding magnified the fear. Parents watched their children for signs they could not interpret and symptoms they did not understand. A warm forehead might mean fever, or teething, or divine punishment, or something else entirely. A faint rasp could be harmless or ominous, so parents hovered with anxious focus, trying to distinguish between ordinary fussiness and the subtle beginnings of catastrophe. They had no tools to diagnose, no instruments to measure, no professionals to summon in the middle of the night. What modern medicine would classify in seconds, they had to judge by instinct. Because of this, many Tudor households developed elaborate nighttime check routines. A mother might reach out every hour to feel her child's chest rise and fall. A father might stoke the fire lightly to keep the room warm, but not too warm, fearing both cold and heat. Some families slept in tightly clustered arrangements, not only for warmth, but so multiple adults could monitor the child. Others kept older siblings close so they could alert parents if the infant stirred oddly. Sleep was never deep. It was shallow, fragmented, dictated by the rhythms of a child who might need attention at any moment. Swaddling, a common practice, offered both comfort and danger. It restricted movement, which parents believed prevented harm, but it also limited the child's ability to shift position if they struggled to breathe. A baby bound too tightly might suffocate silently, the fabric hiding their distress. Yet not swaddling a child felt equally risky. A cold infant was a vulnerable infant, and houses at night were cold enough to make teeth chatter even under thick blankets. Parents chose between options they knew could be dangerous in opposite ways. Illnesses also behaved unpredictably in children. A child might go to bed with a minor cough and wake unable to breathe. Fevers could skyrocket in hours, accompanied by delirium, crying, or terrifying stillness. Smallpox, measles, and whooping cough, diseases that ravaged Tudor childhood, spread easily in cramped nighttime conditions. If one child fell sick in the night, siblings often followed. Parents listened with dread not only for silence but for the wrong kinds of sounds. Choking, wheezing, gasping, or the strangled cries that signalled a sudden turn for the worse. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was that parents often noticed too late. With only moonlight or a weak candle, they couldn't see a child's face clearly. A flush might go unnoticed. Shallow breathing hid easily. By the time dawn arrived, parents realised that the child's silence hours earlier had been not rest, but departure. Tudor records are filled with accounts of parents discovering lifeless infants at sunrise, shocked despite being accustomed to loss. No amount of familiarity ever softened the blow. This grief created spiritual anxieties as well. Some believed infant death was divine punishment. Others believed it was divine mercy, sparing a child from future suffering. Parents prayed fervently for protection, hung religious symbols above cradles, or recited verses before bed in hopes of warding off the invisible dangers stalking their children's dreams. But faith only eased the fear. It never erased it. Every parent knew, in their marrow, that the night could steal what daylight had nurtured. Night silence changed how parents interpreted morning light. Dawn was not simply the start of a new day, it was a moment of reckoning. Mothers approached cradles with breath held tight. Fathers braced themselves as they lifted blankets. A small movement, a soft cry, a warm cheek. These were morning's greatest gifts. A stillness that did not break was its greatest devastation. Tudor childhood was a fragile, uncertain journey, and no part of it felt more precarious than the hours between sunset and sunrise. During the day, a child lived under loving watch. At night, they lay at the mercy of whatever frailty or fate their tiny bodies could not withstand. In this world, quiet was never simply quiet. Quiet meant the parents listened harder. Quiet meant danger might already be happening. Quiet meant the nursery held its breath until the parents dared to check whether the child still did. Because in Tudor England, nighttime didn't only threaten homes, livestock, or spirits. It threatened the smallest heartbeat, and the silence that followed was the loudest fear of all. In Tudor England, sleeping alone wasn't peaceful, romantic, or introspective. It was dangerous. Solitary slumber belonged to the wealthy, the clergy, or the unluckily isolated. For everyone else, nighttime safety depended on bodies, warmth, and the reassuring noise of other humans breathing somewhere within arm's reach. Privacy was luxuriously impractical. Survival was communal. Most Tudor families lived in 1 or 2 rooms, and those rooms served as kitchen, dining space, workshop, nursery, and bedroom all at once. When night fell, they didn't retreat to separate chambers or drift off in comfortable solitude. They gathered, piling into shared beds, straw pallets, benches, or even nestled together on the floor. Parents slept beside children, siblings beside siblings, servants beside each other, or sometimes beside their employers. Entire households often slept in one space, creating a sleeping arrangement that felt less like a family and more like a well-organised pile. But this wasn't simply a matter of cramped housing. It was a deliberate survival strategy. Warmth was precious. Even indoors, nights could be cold enough to freeze water and stiffen fingers. Fires were banked low for safety, so shared body heat became essential. A lone sleeper might shiver all night. A clustered group slept more deeply, more warmly, and more confidently. Cold could kill, but a sleeping arrangement with 3 generations and a dog offered insulation no blanket could match. Yet warmth was only part of the equation. Proximity meant protection. The Tudor night was full of dangers. Thieves, fires, sickness, animals, and unseen forces. If something happened, having others nearby was the quickest form of alarm. A child whimpering in distress could wake the whole household. A creak in the floor could prompt everyone to sit upright at once. A draught strong enough to fan the fire might wake the lightest sleeper, who then nudged the next, who nudged the next, until the chain reaction transformed into action. To sleep alone was to risk being unaware, and in Tudor England being unaware was a luxury one could not afford. If you slept apart from your family and your home caught fire, who would shake you awake? If you fell suddenly ill, Who would notice your breathing had changed? If you had a nightmare and cried out, who would hear? If a midnight visitor, human or otherwise, entered your room, who would witness it? Solitude didn't offer peace, it offered vulnerability. Even adults strongly preferred sleeping within the sound of others. A travelling merchant staying at an unfamiliar inn didn't hope for a private room. He feared it. Better to share a room, and possibly a bed, with strangers than risk sleeping alone in silence. Shared sleeping arrangements in inns were perfectly normal. Multiple beds packed together, each holding 2 or 3 people, or long communal platforms where travellers slept side by side like exhausted sardines. Snoring was expected. Elbow room was negotiable. Safety was priceless. Parents taught children from birth that the nighttime world was not to be faced alone. Toddlers slept tucked into corners of the family bed. Older children shared blankets or small pallets arranged in clusters. Teens might graduate to sleeping a few feet away rather than a few inches, but the idea of a child sleeping in a separate room would have been considered bizarre, irresponsible, or outright dangerous. Darkness was a threat, and children needed layers of protection, blankets, family, and the simple reassurance of knowing others were there. Shared sleeping was also practical in more mundane ways. Without artificial lighting, waking for nighttime tasks, stoking the fire, checking livestock sounds, comforting a child, required cooperation. Someone had to hold the candle. Someone had to move aside so others could exit the bed. Someone had to respond quickly if a strange noise came from outside. Many nighttime chores were group efforts, conducted with half-awake efficiency and whispered commentary. In wealthier homes, even servants slept communally. Female servants often shared beds in attic rooms. Male servants slept together near their workspace. Being alone meant you were too far from help, too far from warmth, or too far from supervision, all undesirable in a world where the line between safety and danger was thinner than the walls of the average Tudor house. For married couples, solitude was equally unwelcome. Beyond affection or necessity, shared sleeping was a safeguard. Spouses monitored one another's health, kept each other warm, and listened for signs of danger. A husband waking alone might panic. A wife finding her husband absent might fear everything from sudden illness to supernatural interference. Solitude created more questions than rest. But perhaps the most telling sign of Tudor attitudes toward nighttime vulnerability was how deeply ingrained the fear of waking alone became. In a society where life expectancy was low, illness sudden, and danger constant, waking up alone carried a chilling implication. If no one else was near you, perhaps something terrible had happened to them, or to you. People didn't simply fear sleeping alone, they feared the reason they might wake alone. Silence meant isolation. Isolation meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. And so Tudor people embraced a nightly ritual that modern sensibilities might call crowded, loud, or inconvenient. For them, it was the only way to ensure that when dawn came, the entire household greeted it together. Privacy was optional, but survival, that was a group activity. To a Tudor sleeper, the night was not silent, it was alive, a shifting, whispering, groaning symphony of noises with no obvious source and even less obvious purpose. Every creak, thump, rustle, tap, moan, sigh, snap, shuffle, and distant yowl carried significance because nothing in Tudor life made noise without meaning. You didn't ignore sounds in the dark. You interpreted them. And since Tudor people lacked modern explanations like thermal expansion and rodents in the walls, or the house settling, their interpretations leaned toward the dramatic. Every sound had intention, every noise was personal. If something went thump in the night, it wasn't attributed to gravity. It was attributed to a being with a plan. The night created its own language, and Tudor household learned to speak it nervously. Inside the home, the first suspects behind unexplained noises were the building materials themselves. Tudor houses were constructed from timber frames, wattle and daub walls, uneven floors and thatched roofs. Wood shifted, beams strained and joints groaned. In daylight, these were simply structural realities. At night, they became threats. A beam popping loudly in the rafters might signal an impending collapse, or a prowler hiding in the loft. A creak along the floorboards might be the house adjusting, or someone walking slowly, carefully, toward the sleeping family. A sudden snap in the thatch overhead might come from the wind, or an animal settling in for the night. Or for the truly imaginative, something supernatural landing softly on the roof. And then there was the roof itself. Tudor thatching was a habitat, not a covering. Birds nested in it, mice tunneled through it, insects lived their entire social lives inside it. A rustling above your bed was not a poetic autumn breeze. It was traffic. Within the walls, small creatures made their presence known. Mice chewed, rats scurried near, beetles clicked, and spiders, which were everywhere, occasionally produced faint, untraceable tapping noises that Tudors didn't identify as spiders because no one believed something that small had the nerve to make noise. To their ears, any creature loud enough to hear at night was automatically the wrong size. Floorboards also had opinions. Centuries of footsteps had given them distinct personalities, and each board expressed itself differently, under temperature changes or shifting weight. A sudden crack from the far side of the room could send everyone in the household bolt upright, staring into darkness, clutching whatever object was closest. Usually a blanket, occasionally a wooden spoon, never anything genuinely helpful. Outside, the sounds multiplied. Night animals were loud. Dogs barked and growled at things no one could see. Foxes screamed with a startlingly human quality that made villagers rethink every theological certainty they held. Owls hooted mournfully from rooftops. Cats fought in alleys with the energy of creatures who had waited all day for nighttime drama. Chickens sometimes clucked in agitation for reasons that remained forever mysterious. And if you lived near livestock, the nighttime groans, stomps, and snorts of cows or horses ensured no one slept with confidence. Wind made its own mischief, especially when it found a loose shutter, unlatched door, or gap in the walls. A breeze pushing through cracks produced long, hollow moans, sounds a Tudor ear could easily label as ghosts, demons, curses, or an ancestor expressing disappointment. A rattling latch could mean a storm approaching, or someone testing the door. A sudden whistle might be air pressure, or a witch passing overhead, depending on who you asked. Because Tudors didn't know what caused most sounds, they created explanations based on the world they did understand: spirits, sin, danger, and human agency. If something scratched at the door, perhaps it was an animal, but perhaps it was someone trying to get in. If the floor creaked under unseen footsteps, perhaps the wood shifted, but perhaps a restless soul was pacing. If a window tapped, maybe a branch brushed it, but maybe something was asking to be let inside. Ambiguity was not comforting. Ambiguity was suspicious. Even domestic sounds were stressful. Babies made noises that parents listened to obsessively. Adults breathing could sound wrong. Someone coughing could signal the start of illness, requiring instant wakefulness for the entire household. A sleeper turning over might jolt everyone else awake, hearts pounding, because in Tudor darkness, the line between ordinary and ominous was as thin as the cracks in the walls. Night noises also carried social implications. If you heard footsteps outside your home, it could be a traveller passing or a thief scouting. If you heard murmuring voices, it could be neighbours returning late, or a secret gathering. The dark turned sound into a surveillance system, but one without clarity. You always knew something was happening. You rarely knew what, and that ignorance bred fear. Tudor people didn't shrug off sounds. They reacted. A noise in the night could lead a father to rise with a lantern and staff, ready to confront danger. It could drive a mother to check her sleeping children, counting their breaths like prayers. It could inspire whispered speculation, hushed prayers, or renewed fear of curses or misfortune. Every unexpected sound became a plot twist, and perhaps the most unnerving aspect was this. The night didn't need to be loud, it needed only one noise, one single unexplained sound to command the household's full attention. A thump, a scrape, a whisper, a subtle tapping, A too long silence. In Tudor England, the dark didn't frighten you by what you saw, it frightened you by what you heard and couldn't explain. Every sound had a motive, and none of them, in a Tudor mind, were friendly. In Tudor towns, animals didn't merely coexist with humans, they cohabited, strolled, rummaged, clattered, howled, and occasionally judged. Daytime already had its fair share of four-legged chaos, but nighttime transformed the streets into a restless, unsupervised petting zoo where the animals weren't pets, and absolutely none of them respected curfew. These weren't forests filled with mysterious wolves or aristocratic hunting estates filled with elegant deer. Tudor nighttime animals were far more familiar, and somehow much more terrifying. They were pigs, dogs, goats, chickens, horses, cows, rats, cats, and the occasional donkey with a dramatic streak. You feared them not because they were exotic predators, but because they were your neighbours, and you knew exactly how untrustworthy they were. During the day, livestock were loosely supervised. At night, supervision simply stopped happening. Barn doors didn't always latch properly. Fences leaned suspiciously, gates didn't hold. Animals, like humans, were opportunists. A night offered the perfect cover for exploring freedoms they were not meant to have. If a cow figured out how to push open its enclosure, it didn't wait for dawn to test the theory. It wandered into the street at midnight, leaving hoof prints on the threshold of someone else's house, and creating noises that made residents rethink every recent decision. Pigs were the most notorious nighttime offenders. Tudor pigs had free-roaming privileges in many towns, even during the day, but at night they became agents of chaos. They rooted through refuse heaps, overturned baskets, nudged open loose doors, and occasionally knocked over inattentive people. A pig in the dark wasn't adorable. It was a solid, muscular core creature with poor eyesight and excellent motivation. If you heard something snoring outside, it wasn't a monster. It was worse. It was a pig that had spotted unattended food. Dogs, both owned and stray, also dominated the nighttime ecology. Some barked endlessly at shadows as if trying to warn the entire town of imminent supernatural danger. Others patrolled the streets like self-appointed constables, chasing anything smaller than themselves and snarling at anything larger. Packs of stray dogs were an actual concern. They scavenged aggressively and got into fights that echoed through the alleys. Hearing a sudden outburst of canine violence outside your window was a reminder that the town at night had rules of its own, and none of them were kind. Goats, meanwhile, approached nighttime with the lively curiosity of creatures absolutely unburdened by self-awareness. They would climb, knock things over, chew objects left outside homes, and occasionally stare menacingly through windows with horizontal pupils that made Tudors suspect demonic involvement. A goat chewing your laundry at noon was annoying. A goat chewing your laundry in the dark was a cosmic omen. Chickens contributed to the nighttime soundscape as well, though their participation was more chaotic than threatening. Some clucked, some fluttered, some escaped their coops and ran down streets like tiny feathered fugitives. Others perched in unexpected places, on steps, on barrels, on roofs, because nighttime poultry logic didn't require explanation. Rats, however, were the reigning monarchs of Tudor nights. Rats lived everywhere, under floorboards, behind walls, beneath refuse piles, along gutters, inside barns, and occasionally on rafters where they held midnight meetings that no one wanted to attend. They chewed through sacks of grain, stole food, and made bold runs across open streets. A rustling sound in a Tudor alley at night was almost guaranteed to be a rat. And if it wasn't a rat, that was even worse, because then you had no idea what it was. Cats, useful for rodent control, wandered freely and emitted unsettling cries at night. Sounds so eerily human that Tudor people frequently mistook them for supernatural wailing. A cat fight could wake the dead or at least convince several neighbours that witches were having an argument outside. Cats became nighttime enigmas, guardians against vermin, but also sources of heart-stopping screams that made everyone clutch their blankets. Horses and cows also caused concern. If these large animals got loose, they didn't just make noise, they created hazards. A horse wandering a dark street became a shadowy obstacle with hooves capable of rearranging your bones. Cows, if startled, could charge blindly in any direction, including straight toward a house. And because street lighting didn't exist, you often didn't know a horse or cow was loose until it was 3 feet in front of you, or until it walked into something loudly. The sheer unpredictability of nighttime animal behaviour fed Tudor anxieties. You might hear a thump outside your wall and wonder, is it a thief, a wandering soul, a pig? The worst part wasn't the uncertainty, it was that all three were equally plausible. People adapted to these nightly disruptions with caution. They secured what they could, brought animals indoors when possible, and checked doors repeatedly. Still, they knew they could not control the ecosystem of the streets. Night belonged to the creatures who didn't care about human plans or sleep schedules. Residents sometimes opened their doors in the morning to discover trampled gardens, mysterious droppings, overturned tools, or an unfamiliar chicken sitting confidently on their doorstep like it was owed breakfast. And animals weren't just a nuisance, they were a threat. A startled dog could bite, a cornered pig could charge, a goat could do anything because goats respected no law, natural or otherwise. Rats spread disease in the night while people slept, leaving invisible dangers for morning and monsing. Tudor people worried as much about animal-caused harm as they did about human-caused harm. Nighttime didn't bring exotic predators stalking city streets. It brought something worse. Animals you knew, personally, behaving unpredictably, with absolutely no supervision. You feared the beasts not because they were wild, but because they lived nearby, and the night always convinced them to wander. Among all the terrors Tudor people faced at night, thieves, spirits, witches, demons, unexplained noises, none felt as personal, intimate, or inescapable as the sensation of waking up and discovering that your body refused to obey you. Today we call it sleep paralysis. The Tudors called it something far more dramatic, being pressed, hag-ridden, or sat upon by an unseen force determined to steal your breath. And without modern science, what else could they conclude but that something supernatural had entered the room? Imagine a Tudor sleeper waking in the deepest hours of the night. The fire has long since died down to embers. Shadows stretch across the room like long fingers. The house is silent except for the faint breathing of others nearby. And suddenly, awareness. Eyes open, mind sharp. But the body, completely still. Arms and legs refuse to move. A weight settles onto the chest, heavy and suffocating. Breathing becomes shallow, strangled. A presence feels near, watching, leaning close. Panic blooms, immediate and suffocating. A modern person might say, "Ah, yes, R.A.M. Atonia." A Tudor person said, "A witch is sitting on me and intends to kill me." Or, "A demon is draining my life." There was no neutral explanation. Paralysis couldn't be just a bodily glitch. Someone was doing this to you. This condition, happening in the dark, struck at the most vulnerable moment a person could experience. Half awake, unable to speak, barely able to breathe, trapped within one's own body. In an age where supernatural threats were part of daily thinking, the experience was terrifying enough to confirm any theory. One of the most widespread explanations was the night hag, a spirit or demonic female form believed to sit on a sleeper's chest, pinning them down. In rural lore, she was a malicious figure who roamed after dark, seeking victims to torment. She entered silently, perched atop the helpless sleeper, and rode them, squeezing breath, whispering in their ear, or staring into their eyes with unblinking malice. If you woke gasping and immobile, the conclusion was simple. You'd been hag-ridden. Other interpretations were equally unsettling. Some people believed the paralysis meant a deceased relative was attempting to communicate, pressing onto the chest to deliver warnings or rebukes. Others believed it was a devilish attempt to claim the soul, held at bay only because the victim fought it internally. And for many, especially in communities already anxious about witchcraft, sleep paralysis confirmed that someone nearby, some neighbour, some enemy, some person who'd looked at them wrong had used magic to attack them from afar. Physical explanations never entered the conversation. People didn't have a concept of neural misfires or REM cycles. They understood only what they experienced. They tried to move and their limbs refused. They tried to cry out and their voice was locked behind their teeth. They tried to break free and invisible hands held them in place. In a world where control over one's body was essential to survival, losing that control even for a minute felt catastrophic. Worse still was the hallucination element. Sleep paralysis often produces vivid, terrifying visions, shadowy figures at the foot of the bed, a presence looming overhead, whispers, footsteps approaching, cold fingers brushing the skin. In Tudor homes, where darkness was absolute and imaginations already primed by religious fear and folklore, these visions didn't feel like hallucinations. They felt like confirmation. If you saw a dark figure by the window, a demon had come. If you felt hands gripping your arms or legs, a witch had bewitched you. If you heard breathing that wasn't your own, something shared the room. If you sensed a weight lifting just before you regained movement, the visitor had left. And unlike more public nighttime fright, sleep paralysis was deeply private. No witness could say, "Oh, that was just the wind," or "it was a pig." The experience happened in the inner darkness of the mind, yet felt external. Each episode became a personal secret, a story many shared only with the most trusted confidants or the local priest. The fear wasn't just physical, it was existential. Because if something supernatural had visited you while you slept, what did that say about your moral standing? Had you offended God? Had you attracted demonic attention? Had someone cursed you in revenge for some long-forgotten slight? Were you being warned, punished, tested? Such questions could torment a Tudor person long after the paralysis ended, and the consequences could ripple outward. A person who experienced repeated episodes might begin scrutinizing their neighbours more closely, searching for the witch responsible. They might sleep lightly for weeks, dreading the return of the hag. They might fill their home with charms, amulets, herbs, or scriptures to ward off nighttime invaders. They might even insist on sleeping closer to others, hoping proximity would prevent future attacks. Communal sleeping helped, but it didn't eliminate the terror. Even surrounded by family, a person could still experience paralysis. And if someone sleeping nearby noticed the victim struggling, breathing raggedly, eyes open in fear, limbs rigid, it only reinforced the belief that something external was happening. After all, why would a purely internal condition make the body twist or gasp? Priests, unsurprisingly, were consulted often, their explanations typically aligned with theology. A sleep-paralyzed parishioner might be told they were under spiritual assault, or that God was allowing them to be tested. Prayer, repentance, and holy water were the primary treatments, not because priests were unconcerned, but because they lacked any secular framework for nighttime paralysis. They used the only tools they had. And so sleep paralysis became one of the most terrifying nighttime experiences in Tudor life, not because of what actually happened, but because of what people believed it meant. It was personalized, targeted, intimate. Unlike thieves or animals or distant spirits, this fear happened inside you and to you. You weren't frozen, you weren't dreaming, you weren't imagining things. In the Tudor worldview, you were being visited. For Tudor people, the moon was not a gentle celestial ornament. It did not inspire poetry, longing, or wistful sighs, not primarily anyway. The moon was a variable threat level. It was a cosmic supervisor with inconsistent moods, and whenever it glowed too brightly, everyone braced themselves. A full moon didn't mean romance. It meant something was about to happen, and probably nothing good. This wasn't ignorance. It was logic based on the world they lived in. Tudor nights were profoundly dark unless the moon decided otherwise. Without lamps or electricity, moonlight could transform entire landscapes. Paths became visible, shadows sharpened, faces took on pale, uncanny qualities. Animals behaved strangely, people behaved strangely. The moon didn't illuminate the world, it adjusted its settings, and Tudor people interpreted those adjustments as omens. One of the most deeply rooted beliefs was that the moon affected human behaviour, especially mental stability. Tudor-era medical theory leaned heavily on the idea of bodily humours. blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and the moon governing tides was believed to govern internal fluids as well. The logic was beautifully circular. If the moon could pull oceans, surely it could tug at the water sloshing around inside your skull. Thus, a full moon became a medical hazard. If someone's behaviour shifted, if they shouted more than usual, cried unexpectedly, wandered at odd hours, or appeared unfocused, the moon often took the blame. The term lunatic, from luna, Latin for moon, wasn't an exaggeration, it was diagnosis. Doctors, clergy and villagers alike believed the moon could inflame emotions, agitate spirits, worsen melancholy, trigger madness, and intensify existing ailments. A stable person might become unpredictable. A troubled mind might become dangerous. A quiet neighbour might suddenly take up midnight monologues. And if you noticed someone behaving oddly during a full moon, the explanation was obvious. They weren't choosing to act that way. The moon was doing something to them. Crime, too, was believed to spike under moonlight. A bright night gave thieves and mischief makers better visibility, so naturally, people anticipated more trouble. The moon didn't just allow crime, it encouraged it. If a theft occurred under a full moon, some villagers believed the criminal had been pushed into the act by cosmic influence. Blame was distributed evenly, part human, part lunar conspiracy. The idea of moon-driven danger extended beyond humans. Animals were notorious for behaving badly when the moon grew full. Dogs howled more often. Horses pranced nervously in their stalls. Chickens refused to settle. Even rats seemed louder. Tudor logic concluded the moon was agitating the entire living world, stirring creatures like spoons through a pot of restless soup. People walking home under bright moonlight often felt unsettled. Visibility was better, yes, but objects looked distorted. A familiar cottage could appear ghostly white. A tree's shadow could look like a figure standing motionless. A puddle could reflect the moon in a way that made it seem alive. And in a world where night already teemed with thieves, spirits, and untrustworthy livestock, the moon's eerie stage lighting wasn't appreciated. Superstitions grew around phases of the moon as well. The new moon, a time of total darkness, symbolized beginnings, but also instability. The waxing moon meant increasing energy, for better or worse. The waning moon suggested decline, endings, or weakness. Farmers watched the moon to determine planting and harvesting times. Healers paid attention to it when preparing cures. Midwives observed it when predicting childbirth. The moon wasn't background scenery. It was a calendar, a predictor, and occasionally a scapegoat. Some Tudor households believed a full moon made spirits more active, not because ghosts needed light, but because humans were more likely to see whatever haunted them. Others believed witches timed spells to the lunar cycle, adding another layer of celestial dread. Even religious thinkers, though wary of superstition, admitted that people seemed spiritually troubled under certain moon phases. The moon, like darkness itself, was a participating character in the nightly drama. The moon's unpredictability also mattered. Clouds could swallow it suddenly, plunging the world into blackness mid-walk. Then it would reappear dramatically, illuminating a shadow that hadn't been there before, or had always been there, but now looked sinister. The light shifted constantly, creating illusions, making distances uncertain, and turning ordinary objects into threatening silhouettes. Tudor people didn't analyse lunar refraction or atmospheric scattering. They simply responded to the emotional truth. Moonlit nights felt different, and feelings mattered in a world where danger was real and explanations were limited. Some took protective measures. They stayed indoors during full moons, bolted shutters, and prayed a little extra before bed. Others kept candles lit despite the cost, believing artificial light helped counteract lunar influence. A few households hung charms or herbs, not against the moon itself, but against whatever it might encourage. And yet not all lunar lore was dark. Some saw the moon as a timekeeper, the night's only reliable companion. Shepherds used it to guide their flocks, travellers used it to navigate. Lovers, rare ones with the luxury of sneaking out, used it to find their way. But these softer associations were exceptions. The dominant Tudor attitude toward the moon was wary skepticism, tinged with grudging respect. Because the moon was not comforting. The moon was powerful, unpredictable, mood-altering, crime-inspiring, animal-activating, spirit-illuminating, and medically suspicious. The moon wasn't romantic. The moon was suspicious. If Tudor people feared the night inside their own homes, they feared it 10 times more on the open road. Travelling after dark wasn't simply discouraged. It was considered a voluntary audition for tragedy. You weren't being bold, you weren't being adventurous, you were inviting the night to draft your obituary. Tudor roads were already treacherous in daylight. Uneven dirt paths, ruts deep enough to twist ankles or swallow cartwheels, stones protruding like malicious teeth, and bridges that looked as though they were held together by optimism. Now imagine all of that, but invisible. With no streetlights and only the faint glow of a lantern, if you were lucky enough to have one, night travel was basically agreeing to walk blindfolded through a medieval obstacle course. The danger started with accidents, the kind that were embarrassingly easy to cause but catastrophically difficult to solve. A misplaced step could send you tumbling into a ditch so deep that passers-by wouldn't find you until morning, if they found you at all. A slip into a muddy rut could twist your leg, leaving you stranded in the dark, praying the next traveller wasn't a criminal or, worse, an aggressive pig. Then there were bridges. Tudor bridges came in 2 forms, the old ones that sagged under their own age, and the newer ones built by someone who clearly believed structural integrity was optional. Crossing them at night meant trusting your life to timber that might or might not remember how to behave. One wrong step and you'd fall into a river that was cold, fast, filthy, and absolutely uninterested in returning you to shore. Rivers themselves were hazards even without bridges. Many roads ran parallel to waterways, often without barriers. The darkness erased the boundary between land and water. One misjudged step toward what you thought was the road could dunk you directly into the river. And whether you could swim didn't matter. Tudor clothing, heavy and layered, turned into instant anchors in deep water. But physical landscapes weren't the only threat. The even greater danger was getting lost, which was far easier than any modern traveller can imagine. Paths forked unexpectedly, fields looked identical. Signposts were rare, often unhelpful, and sometimes carved by people who assumed everyone shared the same local knowledge. By moonlight, the world flattened into shapes and shadows that confused even experienced travellers. A skilled woodsman navigating during the day could become hopelessly disoriented at night, ending up miles off course, wandering into forests, marshlands, or unfamiliar villages that were not thrilled to see strangers appear after curfew. Travellers who lost their way often faced a second problem: exhaustion. Tudor travel was physically demanding, and wandering through darkness drained mental energy faster than daylight journeys. The longer you stumbled around, the less careful you became, and the more likely you were to step into something sharp, deep, wet, or hostile. And if the landscape didn't get you, the people might. The Tudor countryside wasn't crawling with highwaymen in the cinematic sense, but bandits existed, especially near lonely stretches of road, forest edges, or abandoned buildings. Night was their greatest ally. They didn't need to hide, they were naturally invisible. A traveller with a lantern acted like a moving target, practically announcing, "Hello, I am carrying something worth stealing." Bandits didn't have to be skilled, they only needed to be awake. Some bandits weren't even professionals, they were desperate labourers, discharged soldiers, or local troublemakers who knew the terrain well enough to take advantage of the blind and the lost. And if that wasn't bad enough, some villages had their own unspoken rules about outsiders arriving at strange hours. A traveller knocking on a door after dark was viewed with suspicion. Why were you out so late? What trouble followed you? Were you a thief, a spy, a bringer of plague? Doors stayed shut. Hospitality had business hours. Wild animals added another layer of hazard. Not wolves or bears, but boars, dogs, bulls, horses, and the occasional overly territorial goose. A startled animal could charge at a traveller, especially if provoked by a lantern. Even farm animals turned aggressive when cornered or confused in the dark. A pig at noon might ignore you. A pig at midnight might decide to ruin your week. For those travelling by horseback, the dangers multiplied. Horses, like humans, struggled to see in deep darkness. They stumbled, startled easily, balked at sounds as shadows, and could throw their rider without warning. A nighttime fall from a horse often meant a broken bone, and a broken bone on a lonely Tudor road was essentially a medieval game over. Even groups weren't entirely safe. While numbers reduced the risk of bandits, they increased the risk of noisy arguments, confusing directions, and someone inevitably suggesting a shortcut that led through terrain unsuitable for humans, livestock, or dignity. Travellers rarely attempted night journeys unless absolutely necessary. Urgent business, fleeing danger, getting near to a dying relative in time, or being caught out by miscalculation. Those who did often prayed aloud while walking, not only to keep themselves brave but to alert any nearby spirits, thieves and wandering pigs that they were in no mood for nonsense. And always they listened to the sounds around them. A crack of the twig could be a bandit, an animal, or a hallucination. A distant splash could signal a river crossing that was now far too close for comfort. A low groan might be the wind, or something else entirely. The darkness didn't offer answers. It offered options, each worse than the last. By dawn, anyone who survived a night journey emerged shaken, mud-splattered, and profoundly grateful. They had conquered a gauntlet of terrain, animals, humans, confusion, gravity, and fear, all without the luxury of seeing where they were going. Travelling at night wasn't brave, it was paperwork waiting to happen, and the kind you might not live long enough to file. For a Tudor traveller, reaching an inn at the end of a long journey should have been comforting. After all, it offered a roof, warmth, food, and a bed, 4 luxuries not guaranteed on the road. But Tudor inns came with one notable drawback. Sleeping in them was its own hazard. If night travel was a gamble, then spending the night in an inn was the prize you won, only to discover the prize included splinters, suspicious smells, and the possibility of waking up with fewer belongings than you arrived with. First, we must understand the core issue. Privacy simply did not exist. A traveller who asked for a private room would have been viewed the way modern people view someone asking for a private oxygen supply. Technically possible, but why would anyone expect it? Inns operated on communal living principles. If you rented a bed, it usually meant sharing it with 1 or 2 strangers, while additional travellers slept on pallets, benches, or even the floor. You paid for the right to horizontal space, not exclusive space. A typical sleeping chamber resembled a disorderly human mosaic. Some rooms held 3 beds, others held 20. Men, women, families, servants, merchants, and soldiers all slept in close proximity, creating night acoustics that resembled a choral performance of snoring, coughing, muttering, teeth grinding, and sleep complaints delivered at full volume. If you didn't like noise, tough luck. Silence was not part of the Tudor hospitality package. But noise was the least of the problems. The real dangers were theft, violence, and disease, which came bundled with your nightly fee. Let's start with theft. Inns attracted travellers, which meant they attracted thieves who pretended to be travellers. Some were opportunists, others were seasoned professionals who spent years perfecting the art of stealing valuables from exhausted strangers in the dark. The communal room was their ideal hunting ground. Once the candle was extinguished, no one could see more than a handspan in front of their face. If someone rustled in your belongings, you might not know until morning. And if you did wake up and catch a thief mid-theft, congratulations. You had just created a midnight brawl in a room full of unconscious witnesses. Travellers developed elaborate strategies to guard their possessions. Some slept with their bags under their heads. Others wrapped straps around their arms. A few tied their bags to their belts, creating a medieval version of an anti-theft system, one that worked only if the thief didn't bring scissors. And even then, thieves were clever enough to lift coins, knives, belts, purses, or rings with astonishing delicacy. If your belongings survived the night, it was a triumph. If they didn't, it was expected. Violence was another risk. A shared room meant sharing tempers, and Tudor tempers were famously quick to ignite. Travellers drank heavily before bed, alcohol being cheaper and safer than much of the water, So the combination of crowded quarters, drunkenness, and mutual distrust made a perfect recipe for nighttime disputes. Arguments erupted over who snored too loudly, who kicked whom in their sleep, whose elbow ended up in whose ribs, and who had substandard hygiene, which, to be fair, was often everyone. The worst fights involved strangers with grudges formed on the spot. A single whispered insult or an accidental shove could escalate into drawn daggers or thrown fists. If you survived the night unassaulted, you counted it as a small victory over human nature. But the most insidious threat in Tudor inns was disease. Shared beds meant shared warmth, shared linens, shared parasites, and shared problems. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in inn mattresses which were rarely cleaned and often stuffed with straw that had last seen daylight during a previous monarch's reign. Travellers woke with bites, rashes, or the unsettling realisation that something was crawling across their legs. Bedfellows coughed, hacking up illnesses that travelled freely through the room's airspace. Fevers spread like rumours. A single sick traveller could turn an entire sleeping chamber into an outbreak zone by morning. And let's not forget hygiene. Inns did not offer individual wash basins. Travellers rinsed their faces in shared water or wiped themselves with the same linens provided for the whole room. The air was thick with smells: sweat, ale, damp clothing, muddy boots, human exhaustion, and livestock odours carried in from the nearby stables. Sleeping in an inn was not a break from hardship, it was a continuation of it in concentrated form. Even the beds themselves introduced peril. Some sagged dramatically, others felt like wood planks dressed in linen. Many creaked loudly with every movement, threatening to collapse if the sleeper turned too vigorously. And though the mattress might appear large enough for two, the bed frame often had ideas of its own. People awoke crooked, cramped, or partially on the floor, contemplating whether the discomfort was intentional. Still, for all these risks, inns were essential. Travellers needed them. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, midwives, soldiers and farmers relied on these establishments to endure long journeys. They provided shelter against rain, wind, cold, and far worse entities one might encounter on the road at night. But using an inn required accepting that you shared everything: air, noise, risk, and occasionally a pillow smelling faintly of someone else's nightmares. Some travellers tried to lessen the danger by securing a sleeping spot farther from the door. Others stayed close to the fire or next to someone who appeared unlikely to commit crimes in the night. Seasoned travellers assessed their room quickly: who looked dangerous, who looked sick, who looked dishonest, who snored with concerning enthusiasm. Choosing your bedmate was more tactical than romantic. By morning, survivors stumbled out of the room exhausted. Not because the accommodations were soft, but because every hour was a negotiation between vigilance and fatigue, and yet they were grateful. The night had not stolen their belongings, their health, or their bones. In Tudor terms, that was luxury. You rented a bed, but you shared the night, with strangers, diseases, tempers, critters, and the hope that morning arrived before your luck ran out. If the Tudor mind feared thieves, witches, spirits, demons, animals, and illness at night, it feared one more thing with equal intensity: people's behaviour when the sun went down. Nighttime was morally suspicious. It was when rules loosened, reputations wobbled, and the shadows provided just enough cover for someone to make a decision they would deny until Judgment Day. The Tudors didn't just worry about crime after dark, they worried about scandal, and nothing created scandal faster than anything that hinted at sexual misconduct. Even the smallest rumour, especially one involving nighttime behaviour, could stain a reputation beyond repair. Tudor communities operated like pressure cookers of gossip. Everyone monitored everyone else, and nighttime provided fewer witnesses, but far more imagination. If a man lingered outside someone's window at dusk, that was already suspicious. If he lingered after dark, it was a full moral emergency. The darkness didn't cover sin, it scheduled it. At the heart of Tudor morality was the belief that proper sexual behaviour belonged strictly within marriage. Anything outside that boundary, real, imagined, whispered or invented out of boredom, was treated as a threat to social order. Nighttime, unfortunately, was the perfect backdrop for suspicion. Night visits or stealth courting were common enough to terrify parents. Young men might try to sneak into a lover's house, whisper through shutters, or attempt to climb into a window without alerting an entire household. The success rate was debatable. The danger was not. If caught, the man faced public shaming, fines, or a forced marriage, depending on how amused the local authorities felt. The woman faced harsher judgment, even if the entire situation had been entirely beyond her control. A girl whose virtue was questioned, even temporarily, even incorrectly, could lose marriage prospects, family honour, and her social standing. In many ways, the fear wasn't about the scandal itself. It was about the accusation. One false rumour could ruin a life long before facts had the chance to clear anything up. And in Tudor England, facts rarely outran gossip. Parents guarded their daughters with military-level vigilance. Night was when young women were least safe, not from physical harm, but from the reputational damage caused by someone simply suggesting they might have been somewhere they shouldn't have been. A girl stepping outside after dark could become the subject of whispered speculation before she made it past the yard. Young men were not spared either. A man caught wandering near a woman's home at night could be accused of attempted seduction, improper courtship, or trying to defraud her virtue. Even worse, if she later became pregnant, the man could find himself declared the father by sheer proximity, regardless of whether he'd ever been within speaking distance of her. Nighttime scandals also included secret meetings, real or imagined. Neighbours watched for lantern light in forbidden places, shadowed movement near barns, and hushed voices behind hedges. If a man and woman were seen alone together at night, even if the encounter was completely innocent, the community could interpret it however it pleased. Tudor morality didn't rely on evidence, it relied on vibes. And then there were illicit affairs, which nighttime made both easier and riskier. Married individuals caught sneaking around after dark faced brutal punishments, including public humiliation or legal consequences. Even being accused of such behaviour could cause families to fracture and households to collapse under the weight of social condemnation. Privacy didn't exist, and darkness couldn't create it. Midwives and older women were sometimes tasked with determining moral truth when scandal erupted. They inspected bedsheets, interviewed neighbours, and provided testimony on whether impropriety must have occurred. Their findings were often taken more seriously than logic itself. A bad dream could be doubted. A midwife's word in a scandal case could not. Some nighttime scandals weren't about actual behaviour, but imagined sin. People who walked too confidently in the dark were viewed as morally reckless. A young woman who laughed loudly after sunset invited rumours. A widow who received visitors at dusk risked becoming a cautionary tale. A man returning home late from the tavern might discover half the village had decided he'd been somewhere far more exciting. And then there were the accusations used strategically. If someone wanted to ruin an enemy, they didn't need evidence. They needed timing. Claim you saw him leaving a widow's house at midnight. Suggest you heard a woman whispering to someone outside her door after dark. Mention that you witnessed two silhouettes standing too close under the moon. The darkness made lies easier to sell and harder to disprove. Even innocent tasks could become fodder for speculation. Checking on livestock after dark? Someone might assume you weren't checking livestock, fetching water at night, suspicious, walking home from a sick relative. Reasonable, but dangerous if someone spotted you heading in the wrong direction first. The safest course of action was never to leave your house at night unless you could produce a witness, a sworn statement, and perhaps a notary. Religious teachings reinforced this fear. Sermons warned that night was when the devil tempted people into lust. Any improper thought or act committed under darkness was doubly sinful, because you committed it out of sight, meaning you knew it was wrong. The heart, Tudor preachers insisted, was weakest when the sun set. The irony, despite all this fear, people still found ways to misbehave. Court records overflow with nighttime scandals. secret pregnancies, barnyard rendezvous, kisses traded in shadowed corners, and passionate encounters that took place directly under the noses of watchful neighbours who absolutely did not sleep as deeply as they claimed. But the true terror wasn't the act, it was the rumour of the act. Darkness didn't hide sin, it scheduled it, exaggerated it, weaponised it, and ensured that by morning half the parish had formed an opinion and the other half was pretending not to. Nighttime in Tudor England wasn't just feared because of thieves, witches, spirits, or wandering livestock. It was feared because of people with authority. Darkness created a perfect atmosphere for rumour to mutate into accusation, for suspicion to transform into action, and for the law, formal or improvised, to arrive at your door unannounced. The Tudors feared many things in the night, but none so viscerally as a sudden knock. That sharp, urgent sound that could turn your entire life upside down in seconds. Tudor communities thrived on surveillance. Not official surveillance, but neighbourly observation so intense it bordered on a competitive sport. Who came home late? Who saw whom? Walking with whom? Who muttered something in the tavern? Who closed their shutters too early or too late? Every detail was noticed, stored and whispered. And because the night concealed little but revealed enough, it became the stage on which rumours took their first shaky steps into the world. An accusation didn't need proof, it needed opportunity, and nothing provided opportunity better than the dark. If someone wanted to ruin you, whether over a personal feud, land dispute, jealousy, or pure boredom, they could use the night as their accomplice. I saw a shadow. I heard footsteps. I witnessed someone slipping into their yard. I heard chanting. I heard them whisper. These were statements heavy enough to trigger scrutiny in a community primed for fear. The dark didn't hide crimes. It created space for imagination. Once a rumour began, it didn't walk, it sprinted. By morning, your alleged misconduct, whatever it might be, had evolved into something larger, more dramatic and far more incriminating. Tudor rumour was a collaborative art form. Everyone contributed a detail. By the time accusations reached the ears of local officials, the entire village had rewritten your biography. Authorities took nighttime suspicion seriously. They had to. Darkness was when illicit activities, rebellions, unlawful meetings, and moral offences were believed to thrive. So if someone reported suspicious nighttime behaviour, the constable or night watch might decide to investigate immediately, not at dawn, but right then, in the middle of the night, when the accused was least prepared. The result? Night arrests. A sudden pounding on the door, a lantern shoved toward your window, urgent voices demanding you open up. It was enough to send anyone into panic, innocent or guilty. The Tudors didn't fear the dark nearly as much as they feared the law arriving in it. Because nighttime justice wasn't gentle, it wasn't slow. It didn't ask for your version of events until after you'd been hauled outside in your nightshirt, blinking in confusion and humiliation. Sometimes the accusation involved criminal suspicion, theft, conspiracy, harbouring fugitives, possessing stolen goods, participating in illegal gatherings, or aiding someone the authorities disliked. In other cases, the accusation could be more morally charged: sexual scandal, disturbances, blasphemy, or hosting improper visitors after dark. And the worst accusations, the ones that could upend your entire existence, were those hinting at witchcraft or dealings with dark forces. Being arrested at night for witchcraft wasn't just frightening, it was socially catastrophic. Neighbours would swear they always suspected something strange about you. The moonlight didn't help your case. Informants, sometimes volunteers, sometimes pressured, sometimes self-appointed, played a major role in these nighttime dramas. They reported suspicious noises, unexplained lights, unusual movement, or the whisper of a voice carried through the alley. An argument overheard could turn into a legal matter. A lantern in a barn could imply illicit meeting. A door left ajar could raise questions. The informant didn't need accuracy, they needed confidence, and the law would take it from there. When the knock came, the household erupted into chaos. Someone scrambled for clothing. Someone else tried to keep the fire from lighting their faces too clearly. Children hid under blankets. A spouse whispered frantic questions. Who accused us? What did they say? What did you do? What did I do? The law demanded obedience. Doorways didn't keep the trouble out. They framed it. If the constable entered, he did so with authority, suspicion, and a lantern that illuminated your worst expressions. Being startled at night was considered incriminating. Being confused was suspicious. Being angry was dangerous. Even being calm made officials uneasy. Why were you calm? Reputation offered little protection. A well-regarded villager might still find themselves dragged from their home if enough whispers aligned against them. And avoiding nighttime accusations required not just good behaviour, but the appearance of good behaviour, something almost impossible to maintain in a society fueled by hearsay. Even if you weren't arrested, a nighttime visit from the authorities left a long bruise on your social standing. Neighbours watched as the constable stood at your door. They whispered as he questioned you. They speculated as he left. And the next morning, before you even opened your shutters, the entire village had updated its mental file on your character. You feared the knock not because you had done wrong, but because someone else might say you had. And that was often enough. The night didn't just house danger, it housed accusation, suspicion, and human imagination with insomnia. And in Tudor England, a rumour could be as devastating as any demon. You feared the dark, but you feared the knock far more. For Tudor people, sleep was not an automatic process. It was a calculated spiritual risk. The moment daylight faded, the world became uncertain, permeable, and morally ambiguous. Nighttime was full of forces, natural, supernatural, criminal, imagined, and painfully real, that could invade a household or slip into a person's thoughts while they slept. To lie down and drift into unconsciousness felt less like rest and more like entering a contract. You didn't fall asleep, you negotiated with the universe, hoping your terms would be honoured by dawn. Religion shaped those negotiations. Tudor England was profoundly Christian, and faith woven into every corner of daily life made the night feel like sacred territory. Dangerous, but navigable with the right rituals. Sleep required preparation, not because beds were uncomfortable, though they absolutely were, but because the soul needed protection while the body weakened itself through rest. The fundamental fear was simple. Sleep was vulnerability. To close your eyes meant surrendering awareness. You could not monitor your door, your fire, your children, your livestock, your health, your dreams, or your moral resolve. In the Tudor worldview, anything that happened during this nightly vulnerability could be influenced by spiritual forces, both benevolent and aggressively not. So before bed, families prayed. Not casually, not quickly, but with the sincerity of people who understood that prayer was their final line of defense between themselves and the unknown. The most common prayer was a version of "Now I lay me down to sleep," centuries older than its modern form. It warned bluntly that sleep and death were neighbours. Tudors didn't sugarcoat the stakes. If I should die before I wake wasn't poetic. It was a reasonable contingency. Many families had experienced it firsthand. A child who seemed mildly ill before bed might be gone by morning. An elderly parent might pass quietly. A fever might worsen silently. Prayer was the Tudor equivalent of acknowledging risk before handing your body over to unconsciousness. But nightly prayer wasn't just about mortality. It was about protection. People prayed for their homes, for their minds, for their livestock, for their tools, for the fire in the hearth not to betray them, for their dreams not to turn into divine reprimands or demonic temptations. They prayed against nightmares, against thieves, against witches, against temptation, against misfortune, and against the various invisible things that Tudor theology insisted were lurking outside human perception. Some households added ritual gestures to their prayers, tracing the sign of the cross over themselves, over their children, and sometimes over the entire bed frame. A mother might place a hand on a child's forehead for an extra moment, murmuring a specific blessing she learned from her own mother. A father might whisper a verse from Psalms believed to ward off evil spirits. A grandmother might tuck a holy token under a pillow, believing that God's presence needed a physical anchor. Rooms themselves became part of the ritual. Windows were shuttered not just for warmth, but to prevent wandering spirits or malicious influences from entering. Doors were locked with prayers whispered through the wood. Beds were oriented in ways considered safer. Feet not facing the door, heads not too close to the cold wall, blankets arranged intentionally, as though geometry itself could assist in spiritual defense. Some families used protective objects. Sprigs of rosemary or rue hung above doorways. A Bible placed near the head of the bed. A cross carved discreetly into the bedpost. Charms sewn into the children's clothing. Even those who didn't fully believe in superstition still took these precautions. Night wasn't a time for ideological purity. It was a time for layered protection. You didn't skip steps when your spiritual well-being, and possibly your physical one, was on the line. Many Tudors also prayed for strength against temptation that might come in dreams. Dreams were morally ambiguous territory. A dream could be a divine message, or it could be an attack, or it could reveal personal weaknesses one preferred to keep hidden. People feared dreams because they couldn't control them, and Tudors deeply distrusted anything they couldn't control. Nighttime prayers served as moral armour, the hope that God would shield the sleeper's mind from intrusive thoughts or sinful imaginings. The belief that the devil prowled more freely at night intensified these rituals. Some prayers specifically invoked protection from demons seeking to whisper doubts, encourage misbehaviour, or exploit the half-conscious mind. Prayer wasn't simply spiritual communion. It was a negotiation with unseen forces. Watch over me while I am powerless. Let me wake as myself, not something altered. Families prayed together whenever possible. Shared prayer reinforced unity, an important sentiment when the whole household slept in one room and relied on each other for survival. A family that prayed together before bed felt spiritually armoured together. Parents believed that their prayers could extend protection over their children's dreams, shielding them from fear, sickness, or supernatural visits. And yet the fear remained, because Tudor people understood that prayer did not guarantee safety. It increased the odds, not assured the outcome. Many who prayed fervently still lost loved ones overnight or woke to situations that felt like the divine tests or punishments. Still, abandoning prayer was unimaginable. You didn't face the Tudor night without aligning yourself with divine protection. Doing so would be like walking unarmed into a battlefield wearing a sign that said, "Please attack me, I am not paying attention." The last moments before sleep often involved second prayers, quiet, whispered, almost bargaining in tone. A mother checking the cradle whispered one for her infant. A husband, worried by a cough in his chest, whispered one for himself. A woman, frightened by a noise outside, whispered one for the whole house. These weren't formal prayers. They were spontaneous outpourings of fear and hope. To sleep peacefully in Tudor England required not only physical tiredness, but spiritual readiness. The night was too unpredictable for anything less. You didn't simply close your eyes, you negotiated. With God, with fate, with fear, hoping the contract held until morning. In Tudor England, midnight wasn't mysterious, romantic, or spiritually symbolic in a comforting way. It was the hour people feared most. Not because the world grew darker, darkness was already absolute, nor because the night grew louder, it often fell eerily silent, but because midnight was when death was believed to walk the closest to the living. And death, unlike thieves or witches, did not need an unlocked door. It needed only the quiet stillness of sleep. The idea wasn't metaphorical. Tudor people genuinely believed that death favoured nighttime visits. When someone died during the day, it was tragic. But when someone died at night, especially around midnight, it was meaningful. Midnight suggested intention. Midnight suggested selection. Midnight suggested that death had come on schedule. Part of this belief stemmed from experience. Houses at night were cold, still, and fragile places. Illness worsened in darkness. Fevers rose, breathing faltered. Weak bodies slipped into quiet decline. And because families were asleep, there were fewer hands to notice a sudden shift, fewer voices to call a healer, fewer ears to hear a last struggling breath. Many people, children, elders, the sick, the exhausted, simply left the world while the rest of the household slept beside them unaware. By morning, the death often felt uncanny. "He was alive when we lay down," someone would say. "We heard her breathing at night," another insisted. And then came the phrase repeated in countless Tudor accounts of loss: "Death took them in the dark." Death, in the Tudor imagination, was an entity that chose its timing with purpose. Midnight was especially charged because it was considered the turning point of the night, the moment when the living world paused and the spiritual world surged. Clergymen warned that midnight blurred the boundaries between body and soul, that angels and demons drew closer, and that God's judgment sometimes fell when people were too unconscious to resist sin or plead for mercy. Midnight marked a shift, an invisible hinge between one day and the next, between struggle and surrender. Families who had sick relatives rarely slept deeply. Someone always listened for breathing, for coughing, for restlessness. But no family could stay vigilant every second, and illness exploited those gaps. When a dying person took a sudden turn at midnight, it felt less like coincidence and more like cosmic timing. The household would gather at dawn in grief and apprehension, whispering that death could have chosen any hour, but chose the one when the world was least able to defend its loved ones. People began to treat midnight with ritual caution. Those tending to the dying would pray more intensely as the hour approached. They adjusted blankets, offered sips of water, held cold hands, and begged God to spare the sufferer until morning, when the sun's return might strengthen the spirit. Survival until dawn became both a medical hope and a symbolic victory. If the dying held on through the darkest hour, perhaps they would hold on longer. Yet midnight deaths were interpreted not just as medical failures, but as spiritual messages. Some believed that if a person died at midnight, their soul had been claimed swiftly, either by divine mercy or divine judgment. Others believed the spirit lingered briefly in the home, watching the sleeping family before departing. Certain communities even held that a midnight death foretold further misfortune, as though death, now familiar with the household, might return. The fear extended to those keeping vigil as well. Sitting beside a dying loved one at night was an act of devotion, but also an act of courage. The room was dim, lit by a single candle that wavered with every breath of the dying person. Shadows flickered unnervingly. Every sound, every groan, sigh, or sudden silence seemed like a sign that the veil between worlds was thinning. And if the final breath came at midnight, the watchers felt they had witnessed something holy and terrifying at once. When a person died at night, certain rituals immediately followed. Families closed the eyes of the deceased before dawn, believing the open gaze might trap wandering spirits or frighten children. They covered mirrors to keep souls from becoming confused. They opened windows or shutters, even in winter, to let the spirit depart freely. And they sometimes rang small bells or whispered prayers to keep death from lingering too long in the room. Neighbours, upon hearing of a midnight death, reacted with solemnity and caution. Some avoided the house for a day, not out of disrespect, but out of fear that death wasn't finished. Others brought food or help, but would not stay after sunset. Even those who considered themselves rational took the timing seriously. Midnight deaths were too common, too consistent, too spiritually resonant to ignore. Children learned early that midnight held weight. Stories circulated of relatives who died precisely when the church bell marked the hour, of sick infants who passed just as the fire died, of elderly grandparents who slipped away when the house fell into deepest stillness. Midnight shaped the Tudor imagination the way sunrise shapes modern optimism. It didn't just end the day, it reminded everyone how thin the line between life and death truly was. And so midnight became an hour people felt rather than saw. The candle dimmed, the breathing around the room shifted, the night air grew colder. Superstition, religion, and lived experience merged into one shared understanding. If death intended to visit, it would come now, and if the household made it past that hour, if everyone breathed, stirred, or whimpered in their sleep, there was relief. whispered gratitude, and the quiet hope that death had moved on to someone else's door. Midnight wasn't poetic. Midnight was punctual. For Tudor people, fear didn't simply increase at night. It changed its nature. Daytime fear was practical, observable, and often solvable. A broken cart, a sick cow, a stern constable, a neighbour in a bad mood. Daylight gave information. It clarified shapes, faces, sounds, and consequences. It allowed the mind to categorize danger, place it into familiar boxes, and respond with tools, teamwork, or prayer. Night, however, stripped the world of clarity. It introduced a psychological landscape far more dangerous than any physical threat. What Tudor people feared most in the night was not always the thief, the spirit, or even death. It was their own minds. At night the world shrank. The darkness pressed against the walls, pushing people inward into their own anxieties, guilt, memories, suspicion, and imagination. In the day, you could distract yourself with work, chores, noise, and conversation. But at night, when the fire sank low, when the children slept, when the house settled, when the voices faded, the mind filled the silence. Isolation sharpened every thought. A creak in the floor became a message, a draught became a presence, a shadow became a figure. The Tudors did not have the scientific vocabulary to explain tricks of perception or the brain's tendency to invent patterns, so the mind's nighttime creativity had free range to interpret every stimulus as malevolent. The psychological shift was intense, even predictable. Daytime logic slipped away after dusk. The same person who confidently explained the behaviour of animals, weather, or tools during daylight hours could become convinced, after a few minutes in total darkness, that their house sat atop a spiritual crossroads, or that their deceased aunt had returned to scold them for unfinished chores. Night unleashed imagination. And imagination in Tudor England had a long history of terrifying itself. Isolation amplified everything. Even in a crowded home, the inability to see far distances produced a sense of separation. You could hear your family breathing but still feel alone with your thoughts. You could whisper a prayer and feel it dissolve before reaching God. The darkness removed context from every sound and object, and the brain rushed to provide its own, usually the worst possible interpretation. This wasn't merely superstition. Tudor people lived in a world where danger genuinely hid in unpredictable places. Illness, crime, punishment, fire, the supernatural, and the natural. Their fears weren't fantasies, they were reflections of lived experience. Night concentrated those fears, compressing them into a window of vulnerability when the body wanted sleep but the mind refused surrender. Psychologists today would describe nighttime Tudor anxiety as a combination of cognitive distortion, sensory deprivation, and heightened vigilance. But Tudors didn't have psychology. They had storytelling. And storytelling, especially in the dark, was a dangerous ally. Tales of wandering spirits, witches' curses, prophetic dreams, demonic temptations, and nighttime mischief weren't entertainment. They were cultural frameworks for understanding the unknown. And the unknown thrived at night. The Tudor day kept these stories manageable. In sunlight they lived harmlessly in memory, discussed with humour or scepticism. But once darkness fell, the boundary between narrative and reality thinned. Every scary story you'd ever heard, every whispered warning, every sermon illustration, returned with exaggerated clarity. Your mind replayed them with stunning confidence, sometimes adding new details as though fear itself were a creative collaborator. Even guilt became louder at night. The Tudors believed that sinful thoughts or actions attracted supernatural attention. So if you'd argued with someone at the market, lied about a debt, skipped church, or indulged in even the mildest impropriety, nightfall prodded your conscience like a rude reminder. Day let you ignore your misbehaviour. Night made you stew in it. Shadows have a way of turning moral doubt into spiritual terror. Night also worsened emotional vulnerability. Loneliness felt lonelier. Grief felt sharper. Worry felt heavier. The Tudor night didn't just hide dangers, it amplified the emotional weight of every unresolved fear. Something about the silence made your mind whisper the questions you avoided during the day. What if I fail? What if my child gets sick? What if the crops die? What if God is displeased? What if that noise wasn't just the house? In this way, Tudor fear of night wasn't primarily about monsters or witches. It was about uncertainty, the absence of certainty, the absence of proof, the absence of control. Day let Tudors categorize risk. Night refused to categorize anything. Darkness invited imagination to fill the gaps with its most dramatic possibilities. And in a world already filled with danger, imagination had a full pantry to work with. Another factor made night uniquely terrifying, the impossibility of action. During the day, if you heard something suspicious, you could investigate. At night, investigation was often dangerous or pointless or simply impossible to perform without falling over something, waking the entire household, or discovering something you would prefer not to know. Thus, the Tudor night created a paralysing dynamic. You feared danger, and also feared confronting it. People learned to lie in the dark and wait, trying to discern whether a sound required a response or whether responding would make everything worse. The inability to act, combined with heightened imagination and isolation, created a psychological environment perfectly engineered for dread. Day explained things, night let them explain themselves, and their explanations were never kind. This is why Tudor terror was not simply about external threats, it was about internal ones. The night created a world where the imagination became both storyteller and villain, anticipating disaster long before disaster appeared. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared, fear usually receded. The same room that felt haunted became ordinary again. The same shadow that looked like a figure was revealed to be a cloak hanging on a peg. The same noise that sounded like a demon became a loose shutter. The mind reset itself with the arrival of light, and the Tudors, relieved but exhausted, learned the nightly lesson once again. Daylight restores the world, night redefines it. After 23 chapters of Tudor nighttime misery, fires, thieves, witches, demons, animals, illness, scandal, arrests, dreams, moonlight madness, and the occasional goat with an attitude problem, it's tempting to imagine Tudor people were simply melodramatic. Surely they exaggerated. Surely their fears were overblown. Surely the night wasn't that terrifying. But here's the unsettling truth. Every fear they held made complete logical sense. Night in Tudor England wasn't a poetic backdrop. It was a daily obstacle course designed by nature, circumstance, and human imagination working in perfect dreadful harmony. And if a Tudor adult seemed jumpy, cautious, or spiritually over-prepared after sunset, it was because their world genuinely rewarded those who treated darkness like an adversary rather than ambience. The simplest fact was this: night removed your tools for survival. No light, no visibility, no reliable way to assess danger, no ability to identify shapes, sounds, or intentions. Sight collapsed into uselessness, hearing took over, and the brain, bless it, filled every sensory gap with its own dramatic interpretations. The Tudors weren't afraid of BG because they lacked courage. They were afraid because shadows erased everything they needed to understand the world, and danger loved that. Nearly every category of Tudor fear at night aligned with something real. Fires really did spread uncontrollably when candles toppled. Thieves really did use darkness as cover. Sickness really did worsen without warning. Children really did die quietly in their sleep. Animals really did roam the streets and attack when cornered. Rumours really did destroy reputations overnight. Authorities really did perform midnight arrests. Travellers really did vanish on the dark roads. Inn rooms really did contain more parasites than pillows. Psychological terror really did escalate when isolation and imagination teamed up. To live in Tudor England was to live without guarantees. Day offered stability, however rough, however exhausting. Night erased it in an instant. And so the fears people carried weren't childish phantoms, they were adaptations. They were survival logic. Fear was not an overreaction. Fear was strategy. The Tudors developed systems around their fears, not because they enjoyed being terrified, but because every rule had been written by past disasters. Locks were reinforced because someone's cousin had lost a chicken to a nighttime visitor. Curfews existed because people kept stumbling into trouble after sunset. Prayers became routine because families needed something, anything to grab onto when the world beyond the fire's glow turned unknowable. Even supernatural fears had roots in genuine vulnerability. When you live in a world where illness materializes silently, where death strikes between breaths, where dreams feel prophetic, where justice is inconsistent, and where nature intrudes into your home at will, of course you assume invisible forces are at work. A Tudor person couldn't simply say, "I'm experiencing heightened external locus of control due to sensory deprivation." They said, "Something out there has opinions about me," and frankly, both interpretations summarize the experience accurately. Night also unified the Tudor community. Shared fear created shared habits. Families sleeping close together, neighbours listening for trouble, children taught not to wander, adults maintaining rituals that reinforced structure in an otherwise uncontrollable environment. Their fear shaped social life. It shaped religious life. It shaped architecture, routine, marriage expectations, travel habits, and work schedules. Night wasn't empty space. It was a cultural force. But here is where Tudor resilience shines through. They kept going anyway. Every night they extinguished their candles, banked their fires, laid their heads on lumpy pillows, and hoped for the best. They did this knowing the risks, knowing the fears, knowing that morning was never guaranteed. Their courage wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was ordinary, it was nightly, it was survival. And when morning finally came, when sunlight seeped through shutters, when roosters crowed, when children stirred, when the house regained its shape, the Tudors experienced relief modern people rarely feel. Morning wasn't just another day. Morning was proof. Proof that the fire hadn't betrayed them. Proof that thieves had stayed away. Proof that illness had not worsened. Proof that nightmares hadn't followed them into waking life. Proof that the knock hadn't come. Proof that God had heard their prayers. The good news, you survived the night. The bad news, you have to do it again tomorrow. That was the rhythm of Tudor life. Darkness, fear, negotiation, survival, dawn. Repeat until death, preferably not at midnight. In a world without electricity, without certainty, without scientific explanations, night meant vulnerability. But it also meant persistence. For all their fears, Tudor people possessed an astonishing ability to adapt. They created rituals, stories, warnings, and routines not because they were ruled by terror, but because they wanted to live. Their fears weren't signs of weakness, they were signs of awareness, and every sunrise was a quiet victory, a triumph of endurance, a whispered thank you, a moment of relief before the sun dipped again and the world once more turned off. You survived the night, and somehow in Tudor England that was enough.